What you're about to watch is the culmination of 5 years of studying the lore and stories of Destiny. This is the complete story of Destiny so far, until Destiny 3 comes along, that is. Now, I know that a lot of you who are in my audience absolutely love these long videos, but for those of you who are watching this and are thinking that the video is something you might not want to watch in one stretch, don't worry, I have designed it quite deliberately with that in mind. I've broken the video up into a bunch of different chronological sections so that you've got different points where you can stop and start at your leisure. Beyond just this, if you want to catch up in a particular section, or if you are simply missing one part of Destiny's history, you can find a timestamp to navigate to them down below in the description, unless you are watching this live at the premiere. Before we start, I think I should also lend my thanks and my words here to a pair who helped immeasurably in the process of creating this video, Captain Tullus and Mr. Monkus. Tullus helped me edit this massive project and to create something truly incredible for you all to watch, and Monkus helped create pieces of artwork that outlines the start of each section of the video, artwork which he did for free even when I repeatedly asked to commission him. The very least that you guys can do is show your appreciation for these two gentlemen in the comments section down below, and if you love any of the art that you've seen in this video, you will find a link to Monkus' website down below where you can buy prints of all of the pieces that Monkus creates. These ones may be up there by the time this video is live. But with all of that said, I think we've waited long enough. It's time to tell you all the complete story of Destiny, from the ancient history of Fundament, all the way to the Shadowkeep of Luna. So, let us begin. History of Destiny starts not with humanity, and not with Earth. The records from this time supposedly date back millions of years with a record of histories and ceremony kept by the Hive, known only as the Books of Sorrow. The veracity of these accounts is sometimes thrown into question, with one of the Hive guards even scrolling in its pages that they are full of lies. But as it stands, these books represent our only record of a series of times from millions to potentially hundreds of millions of years ago that would otherwise be lost and unrecognizable to us. And so, with nothing else to tell us any better, and armed with the knowledge that these records may be imperfect, we must start with the records made in the Books of Sorrow, not of Earth, but on a distant shadowed world called Fundament. Fundament was a gas giant, one so massive that its gravity could pull other planets down beneath its clouds, where they would impact on its surface oceans. The remains of these planets would form into continents, and on these continents, life of a sort would struggle to carve out an existence. The smallest form of life on Fundament was that of the krill, and they were constantly under threat from the harsh world upon which they lived. There were many nations of krill, and one such nation was the Osmium court, and their king, its ruler, was about to be put through dire straits. Their king was 10, a long and withering existence for the short-lived krill, save for their mother spawn who lived significantly longer. The king of the court had 3 offspring: Shiro, the youngest, who aspired to the ways of combat so she might seek adventure and defend her people; Sophona, the wisest, one who wished to consume the royal jelly and become a long-lived mother so that she could learn all of the secrets of the world; and Aurash, the eldest, she who was to become the next ruler of the Osmium court, she who was to take the kingdom and to replace her aging father. Though they could not possibly know it, these 3 siblings would change the universe forever, and would be led down a path of destruction so great that it would shake the foundations of reality itself. But this all began with their father's assassination. Their father was senile at the time. Most krill who were long-lived would die at the age of 8, but at 10 years old the king was being driven to madness. But to some, it was evident that there was at least some method in his madness. He would study the sky, raving of moons above Fundament's eternal storm clouds, and always he was accompanied by his familiar, a white worm-like thing that was dead but had washed up from the sea depths. In a state of despondence and in response to the king's consistent madness, Teox, another of the Osmium court, wrote to their arch-enemies, the Helium drinkers, begging for them to kill the king of the Osmium court and to slay his 3 offspring, offering to rule as a regent for them beneath their command in his stead. The Helium drinkers happily accepted and slew the Osmium king, but they were not fast enough to slay his progeny. Shiro, Sophona, and Aurash fled with their father's familiar and took a ship out onto the great oceans of Fundament. Upon its mast, they swore in blood that in their lifetimes they would return to the Osmium court and avenge their father, kill Teox and the Helium drinkers, and understand the doom that their father spoke of as he raved in what many believed to be madness, but the sisters were slowly starting to realize might well be something to be concerned of. The doom that their father spoke of was later divined by Aurash, who remembered the last words that her father had said to her, namely, that the moons were different and that the laws were bent. He made a sign representing a syzygy, and it was this that revealed to Aurash the nature of their doom. In the skies above Fundament, there were 52 moons in orbit. But if all of them fell into the correct alignment, they would pull in the same direction all at once, and they would therefore pull the vast waters of Fundament's oceans into a massive bulge filled where they lay. When the combined force of their gravitational pull passed, the mass of water would then be dispersed in all directions, in the form of a tidal wave that would swallow whole civilizations, a god wave. Their quest was now even more urgent. Shiro, Sophona, and Aurash needed to not only defeat the freighters, but to save their world and their people from extinction. In their extended travels, they found a great crashed ship, an artifact of a bygone era, an artifact of a greater civilization. This was not necessarily a seafaring ship. It was potentially a spacefaring one. It was Vanguard, and they had only found it thanks to the whispering of their father's worm, which was now held by Sophona. The dead familiar that the king had always brought with him was apparently able to communicate with her, and with its advice, they held onto the needle instead of selling it. They then took a further 2 years not only to repair the ship's systems, but also to deeply understand them. But as 2 years passed, Sophona grew worried. She believed that they would not have the time they needed to see the dream of their vengeance realized. It is then that Ulrash stated that they should die. They had long since learned that they could use the ship to chart the immeasurable depths of Fundamental oceans, and Ulrash believed that below the waves, closer to the planet's core, they might find answers. Shiro protested, remembering the bodies of the ship's prior owners and how something from down in the deep had clearly caused their ruin. But Sarahun, who had heard the one familiar whisper to her of the plan's brilliance, agreed with Ulrash. And so, the descent began. Through the crushing depths and past terrifying beasts, the siblings ventured until they came to a still place. Here, they monitored the waves above, and the defenses of the ship, faithless that their fears of a strategy were indeed true. It was indeed coming to pass, and it was at that moment that they encountered the Leviathan, a creature as massive as the continents of their childhood, and it spoke to them, urging them to turn away from the depths of Fundament and from the deep of itself. The Leviathan's voice was booming inside their heads, massive, forceful, and determined at first. But when finally it was exhausted by the protests of Ulrash and Shiro, Safona would state that they should die. Her justification was completely clear at this point. She stated that she was guided by her father's familiar, and this was what had given them hope, whilst the Leviathan merely wished for them to return to the surface of Fundament to live short lives and die. And so they continued to dive deeper, down into the crushing depths of Fundament's core. And down those depths, Ulrash found herself standing unprotected on the hull of the ship. But in spite of the immense pressure and heat, she was unharmed. Before her there were 5 massive creatures. They were the worm gods. You, the Onyx One, Zal, the Will of Thousands, Ur, the Ever-Hunger, Aya, the Keeper of Order, and Afa, the Worm of Secret. Ancient creatures that served the deep, or as we now know it, the darkness. War offered Ulrash and her sisters a bargain, and told them that the worm gods had been trapped in Fundament's core for eons by the Leviathan. Their bargain was simple. They would be granted immortal life by consuming the children of the worm gods, but they had to always obey their nature as beings. Shiro would be perpetually attempting to test her strength, Safona her cunning, and Ulrash her knowledge of the universe and her explorations of it. The sisters accepted the bargain, and took the worm god's larvae back to the surface once they had all chosen new morphs and new names. Shiro, Safona, and Ulrash ceased to be, and with that, the birth of the ascendant hired gods Shiva-Ra, Sarahun, and Ulrich was complete, with Shiva-Ra taking up the night morph, Sarahun taking up the mother morph, and Ulrich the king morph. Their roles began to the surface of Fundament, feeding the worm god's children to any claw that would follow them, and killing the rest. The war they brought to the surface eventually engulfed all of Fundament, with the survivors falling back to Kahana's hull. The worm gods eventually rose to the surface with them, and escaped Fundament with the forces of the sisters. They pursued Turok, the sterile mother who had betrayed the Osmium dynasty to one of Fundament's icy moons. On that moon, the worm gods discovered that there was another race inhabiting it, known as the Ammonite, and that there was also a 53rd moon hanging above its orbit. Although technically this was not a moon at all. It was a divine presence of the deep polar opposite. It was a presence of the sky, or the light as we better know it. And what was this presence? The Traveler. The crew and the worm gods undertook a campaign of annihilation against the Ammonite. Teox and the Traveler, and whilst Teox would escape during the campaign, the siblings of the Awoken dynasty, especially Ulrich, learned of the ways of the sword logic and embraced its dark power, making them even more terrifying and giving Teox good reason to flee. During the war, though, Ulrich was struck with ideals of pacifism, which enraged the worm gods. They believed in the ideals of the sword logic, that life should be tested against life, that only the strong should remain. The worm that Ulrich had consumed in the depths of fundament yearned for war, and eventually this hunger was starting to gnaw his soul, and led him back into the fray. But even after this, he still offered to parley with the Ammonite on neutral ground. It was then that the worm gods demanded Savathun teach him, and teach him she did. She betrayed Ulrich. She killed him. But Ulrich did not die. Instead, he awoke in his throne world, a part of the Ascendant Realms, and also a dimension where the high Ascendants go when they die. It is only in this Ascendant Realm that he could truly be killed. And whilst Ulrich was recovering, Savathun went to the neutral ground and poisoned it, killing the representatives of the Ammonite that were meant to meet at the point to parley for peace. Before the war was won, the Leviathan came forth from the depths of Fundament, and was slain by the forces of the deep in final battle of Fundament's moon, which shook the world to their core. After burrowing out of the worlds they'd conquered and multiplying at a great pace, the Crow would take up a new name as a species and would be referred to from this moment until time ended as the Hive. They strengthened their resolve and battled each other for over 20,000 years, and then, at last, they set out stronger, and they set out on a campaign of genocide across the universe, fighting many different species and bringing all of them to their end, finding them unworthy of the sword logic's challenge, the test that fate's life should exist with strength. However, they encountered a problem, as Ulrich discovered that the more they fought, the more the hunger of their worms expanded, and so they faced the threat that they would not be able to satisfy their worms' insatiable hunger. This put the supposed immortality that the worm gods had offered them into context, but beyond just this, it set the stage for a greater threat that was looming on the horizon. An alien empire known as the Equine came to face the power of the siblings. They had diverted all their resources into a campaign of utter annihilation against the Hive, responding with overwhelming force whenever Ulrich's, Savathun, or Shivara appeared. They knew exactly how to defeat the Hive, and this was no coincidence, because they were being guided in that method of destruction by Teox, the traitor mother. Eventually the siblings were beaten back so much that they were left with no strength to go on fighting. They gathered in Ulrich's throne world and assessed their options. Whilst Shivara wanted to retreat and gather strength, and Savathun wanted to beg the worm gods for more power, at this point Ulrich knew the logic of the sword better than them both, and knew that they needed to aggressively proclaim their right to exist through war and death. As this truth was affirmed, a plan of action was devised. In this plan, Ulrich slew his two sisters, and by the sword logic became more powerful by proving his might over them. With their true deaths under his wing, Ulrich went to Aka, the worm god of secrets, and told him that he wished to receive the secrets of the deep. When Aka said he gave no secrets, Ulrich rebuffed the worm god, and stated that giving was for the sky, and that he had to take what he wanted, even if it meant killing Aka, even though Aka was his god. And so Ulrich slew Aka the worm god, and from his ruin he pulled the secret of communing with the deep. He recorded that secret in a series of tablets known as the Tablets of Ruin, and hung them about his waist. Following this, he used the secret to enter the deep itself, and whilst his speech with the deep was not recorded, what is known as this: when he emerged from the deep, he pronounced that he was Ulrich no longer. Instead, he was Oryx, the taken king, and that he had the power to take life and make it his own. It was at this moment that Ulrich went out into the universe and unleashed his new powers upon the Ecumene forces, namely his new ability to take, which allowed him to abduct his enemies, corrupt them with darkness, and return them as compliant slaves bound to his will, and given new ability thanks to the power of the sword logic. It was too much for the Ecumene, and eventually they were pushed back and slaughtered. It is here that Oryx enacted two peculiar hive resurrections. Instead of their deaths being true, both Shivra and Savathun were returned to life, each of them respectively summoned back with war and trickery. The Ecumene were eradicated so completely after this that only in the books of sorrow and in the mind of Tails, who yet again had evaded their capture, were they even remembered. All note of them, all memory, all trace was wiped from the universe. Following this, Oryx would have moments and time to commune with the darkness, thanks to the rituals recorded on the tablets of ruin, and the darkness would show him terrible dreamlike hallucinations, replicating his childhood and teaching him to be yet more brutal, to embrace the sword logic even further. Oryx also learned that Shivra and Savathun were at this moment conspiring to leave him stranded on his expedition into the deep. Despite this, he was brought back, and when he was brought back, he endeavored to bring sons and daughters into this world so that he might love and kill them, so that all would be empowered and strengthened. The first of these children was Crota, the Eater of Hope, whose strength was unparalleled and who would one day rise to be one of the greatest champions of the Hive. The second was Nokris, who was feeble in strength but strong in mind, more of a wizard than a knight, unlike his demon brother. The third and fourth of his children came from a single larvae, cleft in two by Oryx's great sword Willbreaker. The larvae became the twin daughters of Oryx, the destined Urdanuk, the Weaver, and Ur-Halak, the Unraveler. Oryx's children accomplished many great deeds, and their stories were numerous. From the creation of the Death Stone to the destruction of whole axioms of the universe, Oryx's daughters, in particular, were highly accomplished. One day, they were cutting a wound in reality, and were proceeding to die inside it. When Oryx inquired as to why, they stated that they would seek to create an oversoul as a way of both hiding their deaths, as well as creating a death impulse capable of defending their throne worlds if need be. Oryx told Crota that he should observe his sisters and try to learn cunning from them, and so Crota too decided that he should experiment with a wound in reality. However, when Crota tore open a wound in reality, it was thanks to Savathun, who had manipulated the wound, that a partially mechanical form of life poured forth from it, a race known as the Vex. The exact origins of the Vex and the nature of their power is shrouded in a fair deal of mystery, but they spilled forth from the breach and began to invade Oryx's throne world. Before Crota could respond by destroying them all, a Vex mind manifested known as Cordia Blade Transform, which deduced the sword logic. With this knowledge of the particular universe in which they stood at their hand, the Vex began to slaughter Oryx's thrall and acolyte, and by right of conquest and slaughter had gained a foothold and presence within Oryx's throne world as they invaded it with force, obeying the logic of the new space that they had found. In spite of Urdanuk and Ur-Halak pulling sword stars from the sky and creating devices known as the Annihilator Totems to stop them, the Vex would press forth unabated. It was only as Cordia abducted the children of the War Gods and discovered that by praising them it could gain even more power, that the one god Aya stepped in, telling Oryx to set his house in order. Oryx returned home and slew the Vex invaders, pushing them and Cordia back. As punishment, he took Crota and threw him into the Vex gate network, saying, "Come home glorious, or die forgotten." Crota would accomplish this, going on to be a legendary demon at the Hive, tearing down his opponents and allowing only a few to survive to tell of the wealth of the Orphean dynasty. But even though Crota had succeeded, there was still a problem, because Oryx's throne world was now left with a tear inside it, a tear that left him weak to a counterattack, or potentially sabotage by one of his sisters. And so, before his court he declared that they would transform his throne world, his part of the ascendant plane, into a physical ship in the material world. This was the Dreadnought, and it was built not only from parts of Akka's corpse, but with the incredibly terrifying, mind-bending power of Oryx and his Hive. His code worked in tandem to create what was effectively a paradox, a foreign world of the ascendant plane pushed into physical space, a screaming, gaping hole in what would be reality. But regardless, Oryx's power was so incredible that even breaking the laws of physics themselves was nothing towards his might. With this accomplished, Oryx's throne world was secure, and now was time to deal with Cordia. He used his Dreadnought to attack a flotilla of ships that was guiding the Nature Thought ship, a great vessel that he believed contained the location of a place of immense light, known as the Giftmast. When he boarded the ship, he found Cordia, and squarely defeated it, even as Cordia tried to simulate him and his power. Cordia was taken, and Oryx presented its remains to Savathun with but a single change from the typical beings of the Taken, namely, that it had a small fragment of its independence still left, and it was not completely bound to the will of its controller. From here, the Hive took their time and prepared to make an assault on the Giftmast, which they had now found. The civilization surrounding this great place of light had been passed over by the Traveler, which had altered the gravity of a black hole so that the worlds around it might not be devoured, and would instead flourish within its now altered accretion disk. They would be provided warmth and sustenance, and their civilization would grow, and as a monument to the light, the Traveler erected a Giftmast, a great spear-like structure that jutted from the black hole and was filled with the power of the light, a gleaming monument rising forth from a singularity, filled with the energies of life itself. The Hive wished to devour this light, and as the deep was moving in this direction to devour the whole system, so too would the Hive naturally be its vanguard. They marched upon the Wishmast, killing the Harmony, its occupant, and the Ahamkara, the great dragons that lived among them. But as the Giftmast was being devoured by Oryx's brood, and as his victory was certain, Savathun departed her brother, saying that they needed to grow distant from each other. She took her nymph and her brood, and they fell into the black hole that the Harmony lived around, never to be heard from again. In the same stroke, Shiva-Wrath took her brood and wings and fled into the night with a similar purpose. Both of their throne worlds became distant and inaccessible to Oryx, and he was left to ponder. It was here that Oryx reaffirmed his choices and his belief in the darkness, but Oryx also pondered the question of what should happen if he should die. He surmised that the one who killed him should be the one who understood the universe in a more complete manner than him, and he believed that he would only be killed by something mighty, something that had some greater knowledge of the sword logic, perhaps, or perhaps with some clever trap. He therefore decided to lay out a means by which he might survive, even if he was destroyed. Within the Books of Sorrow, he created a map to a weapon that exemplified everything that he was. that, in a certain way, was him if created. And the being that wielded this weapon and used it to become mightier than both of them would be Oryx living on, and Oryx deduced that they would become one and the same, a means by which he could truly become immortal, even beyond a true death. This weapon would not see construction for generations, but when it was, it would be a weapon of malice, and we would be the ones to construct it. But the tale of the Owen dynasty would not be simply left there. Oryx's second son, Nokris, who was born as a lesser being of wisdom as opposed to strength, wished for more power, and knew that his strength was in that of his mind. He went to the worms of his god, to Yul, to Zol, to Aya, and Ur, and he petitioned them, asking them for knowledge of the origin of all things. All the worm gods denied him, except one, Zol, the will of thousands, who was lesser than his brethren, and saw that in time he would be prey for his peer Yul. He gave a portion of his power to the young high prince, and taught him the art of bringing forth life from death, necromancy. But the power Nokris held had been given, and not taken, and this infuriated Oryx, who saw his son's actions for what they were, heretical to the very ideals of the sword logic, and the betrayal of his own dynasty. He cast out his son, and removed all record of him from every hive archive. The only record of Nokris that remained was a single statue before the altar of Oryx, which stood defiant in its permanence. These are some of the earliest tales of the universe of destiny, tales that predate even our own history, but as many of you will realize, they are but a small part of a grander cosmic war, a war between formless and form, between the deep and the sky, between the dark and the light. The traveller, the divine presence of the sky, would continue onwards, evading the hive and the darkness, seeking out the call of worlds with the potential to receive its light, for those with meaning in their war. And thus the traveller would make its way to the Elixni, but they would suffer much the same fate as the Harmony and the Ammonite and the Ecumene, and they would suffer at the hands of the darkness and the hive. Their entire system was destroyed in an event remembered only to the Elixni as the Whirlwind, where they were left to make a great exodus and abandon their home, following whatever trace of the traveller they could. The great machine, as they would come to call it, would however find a new place to set its roots. As the Elixni transformed their once noble society into a more barbaric and tribal one, the traveller had begun to take root above a system and a planet far, far away. The name of the planet was Mars, the name of the system was Sol, and the year in the human Gregorian calendar was that of 2014. And in this year, it found us. In that year of 2014, humanity witnessed an unknown artifact entering the orbit of the atmosphere of our closest neighboring planet of Mars. It was clear for all to see. Humanity was no longer alone in the universe. This strange object was of immediate concern to the powers of Earth, and 15 months later, with cooperation, planning, and commitment, humanity sent its response. The combined powers of the People's Republic of China, Russian Federation, and United States of America led to the creation of the most famous space voyage known in human history, the voyage that would come to be known as Ares 1. And so it was that one taikonaut, one cosmonaut, and one astronaut, Chow, Milalova, and Hardy, all set out on a journey that would change history. Mars, of course, is a planet with little to no atmosphere, and yet, when the Edders 1 craft touched down, it did so in the middle of a storm. The breath of God as the wind buffeted them back and forth before landing. This was not some strange coincidence. This was the work of the artifact. And as they took their gear and trekked across the Martian surface, they could start to see the artifact come into view over the horizon. As they crossed the ridge ahead of them, they saw it completely for the first time. It was at this moment that the first Martian rains began to pour, and the actions of the object were made clear. It was terraforming Mars. And something else became clear as well. This alien presence was not some conqueror or some terrible invader, it was instead benevolent. They called it the Traveler, and its arrival and soul would change humanity forever. This would be known as the start of our Golden Age. The Traveler's divine presence would be a boon to our system, and under the radiance of its light, soul, earth, and humanity would blossom. The planets and moons of the system were terraformed, with worlds like Mars and Venus becoming habitable planets, with diverse ecosystems of life and repositories of resources. The moon became the way station for all of the system, sending resources from Earth to far-off colonies on the methane oceans of Titan or the garden world of Mercury. But perhaps the most profound change of them all was the people of Earth themselves. Human lifespans tripled, and the fundamental ethos of our society changed and evolved. Not only were we more intelligent and longer lived as a species, but we also put that knowledge to use instead of squandering it. We cured a myriad of diseases that had haunted us, put study into any number of emerging scientific and philosophical fields, and we extinguished the old hatreds of mankind's past forever. Humanity created vast monuments throughout the solar system as the Traveler worked to feed it with us. From the great Martian city of Freehold to the new Pacifica arcology of Titan, from the solar research stations of Mercury to the Ishtar Academy on Venus. Humanity began to flourish in every place imaginable in the system. Beyond all the places we laid claim to, there were the remarkable accomplishments we attained in this time, with the great minds of the Clovis Bray Corporation and others like them leading the way and bringing forth some of humanity's greatest inventions. The rise of one of these was the most notorious and important of all, the War Mind, Rasputin, a supercomputer tasked with the mandate of defending humanity from extrasolar threats or skyshock alerts. Rasputin was an intelligence of such immense might that it was capable of predicting and calculating threats before having even encountered them, and of devising a solution to them so that they might never threaten humanity even if they did enter the system. Rasputin was armed with a vast defensive array of weapons and doomsday devices that could scorch black the skies of 1,000 worlds in the name of humanity's defense, should the need arise. But this wasn't the only great invention of Clovis Bray. They also created many incredible technologies, such as the intelligent nanotechnology known as SIVA, which could be commanded to construct anything imaginable. This made it a particularly valuable technology to those colonists who were heading outward to the stars, as it could be spontaneously used to create anything from a prefabricated shelter to an oxygen rebreather, if given the correct direction. Furthermore, when relic iron, a mysterious new material, was studied on Mars, the Clovis Bray Corporation discovered an entirely new state of matter, where data was completely free from the restraints of physical matter. This state was known as engram, and it allowed any idea imaginable to be stored. And of course, there were the Exos, a project of Clovis Bray that allowed humans to transport their consciousness into a mechanical body, and live on past the point of normal human life expectancies. However, there are hints in the programming and the past lives of Exos still alive today that give us an idea that they may have been more violent in nature, The exiles dream of a place where they were born, the deep stone crypt, and whilst some of them go there and walk peacefully through a field of golden millet, most of them dream of almost endless battle to reach the town where they were born. But this is not to say that Clovis Bray was not the only one researching remarkable technologies for humanity or making incredible discoveries throughout the system. The researchers of the Ishtar Academy on Venus at this time discovered the ruins of an ancient civilization on Venus that predated humanity by billions of years. These were the Vex, and the ruins they discovered were those of the vault of glass and the infinite steps. The Ishtar Academy and the Ishtar Collective would make it their responsibility to study the Vex and their constructs at any place possible. As our golden age magnified our glory, humanity's greatness shone like a beacon in the night, illuminating the very stars themselves, and convincing us that our destiny was not to remain on earth like our ancestors, or to continue their petty rule, but instead was to reach forwards and upwards to the stars, and to grasp the very majesty and grandeur of the universe itself. We flew out into those stars and spread our wings. Alas, we let our hubris get the better of us. Although we were so ill-prepared or foolish, though, whilst most sat in complacency beneath the glorious bounty of the traveller, some, such as the three families of the Black Armory, would begin crafting phased technology and weapons so that they might fight back or defend themselves. A noble effort, but tragically, it would not be even close to enough to stop what would come next. As the centuries of the Golden Age passed, the war mind began to detect something far beyond the reaches of the system, something dark and terrible, something that spelled their doom. Rasputin's responsibility was to defend humanity, and to this end, the Exodus program was created. A colonization effort that involved thousands upon thousands of souls, all being loaded onto colony ships and sent outward to the stars. But in spite of this titanic effort by Rasputin and his submarines, such as Malawi, in spite of the valiant efforts of General Chen Manchu, in spite of everything that humanity would attempt to accomplish for the end, it would not be enough. As the vessels of the Exodus program began to reach further out towards the edges of the solar system, something terrible and dark swept them back in the other direction. The war mind raised its mighty weapons that were strong enough to shatter the might of stars, and responded to this threat with the full fury of its arsenal. But alas, even this was not enough. The darkness had found our system, and in doing so, had found the travelers. Doom was upon us. The Golden Age was ending. The collapse had begun. The dark tide that was upon our system brought with it a terrible doom that could not be defeated by the war mind and its defences. But the foe Rasputin faced was not by any measure one that could be considered normal. The darkness, much like the traveller, defied simple causality, and defied even the basic rules and logics of the universe. Physics, mathematics, they meant nothing before this entity. It could not be defeated with the weapons of the war mind alone, and it was made clear from this moment that our annihilation was inevitable. The vessels further out in the bounds of our system were crushed by the darkness as they attempted to reach beyond the asteroid belt. These ships would eventually form a mass of broken debris within the belt itself, and this place, this terrifying graveyard of all that humanity had hoped to see, this would come to be known as the Reef. And this would be a fate much like many of those on Earth and its colonies would suffer. They would be crushed beneath the wheel of the shadow of darkness, as it passed ever onwards through the howling void of the universe, killing indiscriminately in the name of its twisted logic that life should be able to fight and meet strength with strength. But the darkness's fury was not yet sated. The darkness had another target in mind. It was also here for the traveler. The details and accounts from this time are limited and unclear, but there are several accounts worth referring to when speaking of the darkness during the collapse. The account from Cave 6's journals speaks of a terrible miasma that spread across the many worlds of the system, holding every human it could find in its grasp, and drowning them in a tide of doom and despair. Cade seemed to point towards the darkness having a malicious consciousness. As it was drowning its victims, the victims were allowed to be fully conscious. They were aware, they were lucid, and yet even as agony and pain washed over them, the darkness wished them to witness the destruction of their world. It wished them to know they had been beaten, outmatched, and utterly destroyed, that they were unworthy of existence, that they were prey, nothing more. The Black Armory papers, a series of journal entries kept by the founder, Henrietta Moran, detailed another encounter with the darkness. Their group had been locked within one of the fortified facilities of the Black Armory, and had to hold back terrible, indescribable creatures that broke through their defenses. They smelled only like wet earth, and made sounds akin to the screeching of machinery. One thing that is made clear by every entry is that the foe that had taken Earth was a terrible one that would see us all destroyed if something was not done. At this time in the system, others were starting to stake their claims too. It was in these moments that another terrible pair of interlopers arrived. Nokris and Vol, the will of thousands, took it upon themselves to claim the planet of Mars, and to lay down an assault on Hellas Basin, where Rasputin's main control center was kept. However, in a successful attempt to hold off the forces of the High Prince and the Worm God, Rasputin used its power to flash freeze the entire region, locking the Worm God, the Prince, and their hive servants away under a thick sheet of ice. In turn, Rasputin too would also experience a period of dormancy. We would hear nothing from Rasputin's true centralized network for centuries, as only fragments of him remained within the various war-mind bunkers that were still active across Earth and its many territories. What happened next is an event clouded in mystery and uncertainty. Some spread rumors that the traveler was in the process of fleeing the system as it had done so many times before. Others spread rumors that Rasputin might have engaged the traveler as it attempted to flee in order to prevent this outcome. And some merely believed that the traveler was attempting to find the right spot to stand and fight against the menace that had embroiled itself throughout our system. Whatever the truth might be, the traveler moved from its previous resting place on Io and found its way to Earth. Here it would make a titanic stand against its enemy, the darkness. The battle was long and would shake the heavens and the earth, a battle of proportions that the universe perhaps had never seen before, of the titanic forces of the cosmos, of a yin and a yang, smashing against each other, breaking upon each other like waves on rock, with enough force to level a mountain and raise it again within the blink of an eye. The two fought, the two stood, the two tested themselves. And what's more, the traveler won. It was crippled and broken, but it sacrificed itself to save us, and to push back the darkness. But its sacrifice was not without some form of hope. With the traveler's dying breath, it created the ghost. Small, autonomous drones filled with the power of its light. These ghosts would serve the forces of humanity, and would seek out those amongst the worthy dead who might possibly provide hope to humanity and its defenders. These would be the few chosen champions that could wield the traveler's light as a weapon. In the earliest days that followed the collapse, these beings were known as the Risen, and whilst they would come later to be known as Warlords or Iron Lords or simply Lightbearers, today they are known by a simpler name: the Guardians. With the terrible events of the final clash ended and the ghosts released into our system, the events that would make up the collapse would come to a close. But there was one far stranger account from the collapse that was given, an account from one of the Exodus program vessels that hit the asteroid belt just as the darkness was approaching in earnest. This vessel, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang-Wei, would become the crucible of the forces of light and dark, and would become the birthplace of an entirely new species of beings. It is here, in these most calamitous of moments, that the people known as the Awoken were born. What follows next is another account that is shrouded in mystery, a report of how a new kind of being was brought into our world, one of both the light and the dark, of the deep and the sky. They were known as the Awoken. Their history is recorded in a series of documents, but the most notorious of these is known as the Marasena, which talks of the rise of their entire civilization and how they came to join humanity in the struggle that had consumed them. It speaks of a great rift not only at the center of the Awoken soul, but also, in time, within the Awoken people. A people that would be riven by circumstance, choice, and their leaders. The Marasena also comes with a warning, namely that in our attempts to grasp this truth, we may in fact mistakenly learn to believe a lie. It is therefore, once again, at this point that I should state that the story of the Awoken's creation is told through a single source, and that the truth of the matter may yet elude us. But with that said, yet again it is our only source of context, and so, as best we know it, this is the history of the Awoken people. Aboard one of the Exodus program vessels, Exodus Green, alternatively known as Yang-Wei, the captain, Alice Lee, detected a strange signal that was following them for approximately 18 hours in radio silence. After repeatedly ignored hails, and just as Captain Lee cut the engine so that she might make a sharp about turn and face their ghostly stalker, a message was received from the well-named Rasputin. Rasputin had detected a hostile extrasolar intruder in the system and had initiated a car-right emergency, bringing all of the potential weapons in the system under his control. Rasputin demanded control of the Exodus Green and its onboard guns. But as Captain Alice Lee decided what to do next, torn between her colonial mission and her duty to Earth, darkness swarmed around the hull of the ship, and through its veil even the light could not be seen. Terrible gravity waves shook the ship as they simultaneously compressed and expanded every molecule of the crew and their vessel. After the vote from the crew came in to continue onward instead of returning to Earth, Alice Lee attempted to send a signal broadcasting a declaration of neutrality to their unknown assailant. Alice Lee stated that they wished to be treated as a separate species that was not party to baseline human conflict or their allegiance to the traveler. She prayed that this would be enough to make a difference against such an indifferent darkness. It was at this moment that two members of the crew were out on the hull. One of them had followed the other out. The first of them, Mara, had gone out there to die alone. She had kicked off the hull with 50 kilometers worth of tether, and her brother, Aldrin, had followed her out into the darkness. As the message requesting the massive entity's indifference was broadcast by the captain, the darkness around them abated, and Mara saw a pinprick of light. It was at this moment that Mara found herself and all the occupants of the crew of the ship behind her, threatening to be crushed between the mighty presence of light that had just arrived and the terrible darkness that swarmed the area. The colossal sources of light and dark that clashed here smashed into one another yet again, filling the space with so much power and energy that the universe itself struggled to maintain what bounds of law that it could. This was a battleground that was being decimated by the powers of two paracausal entities. It was like dividing by zero or counting infinity. And as the two violent entities finally reached an equilibrium, the real effect of the power began to manifest. The universe created a singularity, a gaping black hole, as an effort was made to cease the paracausal forces that were tearing the very seams of reality apart. The forces of the universe swirled and buffeted around Mara, and it was at this moment that the mistakes of the universe were to be swallowed inside the singularity. Everything pulled forth, and darkness and light continued to fight. And at this moment Mara made a choice that would change the universe. She detached herself from the 50 kilometers of tether that joined her and the ship, and together all were pulled down into the singularity. All of them had the same fate, to be swallowed by this black hole. But Mara knew what she wanted. Mara knew her fate. She reached out at the edge of death, and knew that she would be the first. But it was not death and sweet silence that found her. Instead, it was new life, and a place of miracles. The Awoken records next speak of Captain Alice Lee experiencing a primordial divinity of sorts. As her existence increased in complexity, she developed a small sense of purpose that grew and blossomed until she willed into existence the world that she wished to have found for her people, and in doing so, willed herself into that world as a being not of divine presence, but still an immortal one. Then she fell to this earth and lived upon it. She believed herself to be the first among the new peoples, and perhaps the only one. But then, lying on a black stone, somewhere near the crashed remnant of the ship, she discovered Mara. As Mara awoke, she realized where they were, in a world of incredible bounty within the folded fabric of hidden space-time. They were inside the black hole. Alice Lee inquired why it was Mara that happened to be second. Mara stated that she didn't know. The first lie to be told upon this new world. But Alice Lee believed her, and so they went on to rouse their new people into this new world. And so it was that the crew was roused, and out of the original 40,900 crew members that ran away, 30,891 awoke, with 9 being unaccounted for. A council was called, and it led the new people to declare certain principles and verdicts. They called themselves the Awoken, and they were immortal. They called their new world within the singularity the distributory, and they believed that they should never return from where they had been. They created a group of specialists called Utechs to care for the technology of the ship from which they had emerged, and decreed that under careful supervision they would reproduce with wounds of flesh and machine, given that any they added to their number would be immortal too. The population of the new Awoken people was greatly imbalanced, with 3 times more women than there were men, and as a result, until more men were born, they were placed under the protection of the women. Above all, some of the most important verdicts created at this council were the 6th, 7th, and 8th, stating respectively that the Awoken should know and love the cosmos, that the Awoken were created from the covenant of light and dark, but that the covenant was complete, and no further debt should be paid, and finally, that the Awoken were whole in themselves, existing in balance. It was also at this meeting that a final ninth verdict was declared, which was that unanimously the people would recognize Alice Lee as their queen. And so the Awoken went out and explored their new world, charting its seas, forests, and stars. This was a great time of creation and pioneering for the new people, and whilst Alice Lee declared as her first rule that there would be no secrets amongst the Awoken, even here, in this place of new paradise and prosperity, conflict would brew. The Awoken spread across the face of the distributory, and took on as many diverse lifestyles as one could imagine, from intrepid hunters to great seafarers to sage scholars. But amongst those people, differences of opinion would dwell, and some would come to doubt their purpose on this world. Some dwelt within the cities and preached the doctrine that revered the seventh verdict, that the Awoken were made from the completed covenant of light and dark, and that their debt was completely paid. They believed wholeheartedly that their place within the universe carried no responsibilities, and there would be no repercussions for their actions. But those who dwelt within the country, as many Awoken did, were of the acolytes' belief, who did not believe in the seventh verdict, and saw that the clash of titanic forces that birthed them was still going on. They believed that they owed a cosmic debt, one that would eventually need to be repaid. These two ideologies could not be so easily brought into balance. The acolytes and their opposing sanguine believers were divided, but then a spark ignited a flame. An acolyte known as the Diatherm walked into the cities and loudly accused Queen Alice Lee of deicide, the murder of gods. When questioned about this claim, she stated that when Alice Lee had created the world, she could have conceived of it to create the Awoken as gods, so that they might be free from all forms of suffering and pain. Immortality was one thing, but to be truly powerful, and yet to be denied this? Deicide was an appropriate term, perhaps. If this was true, this represented an original sin, and what's more, it represented a secret that Alice had kept, even as she had declared that the Awoken were not to keep secrets. The division between those that believed they owed a debt to the cosmos and those that did not ultimately led to a conflict between the Awoken peoples known as the Theodicy Wars. And whilst the nature of the conflict, at least in the Mara Senate, is indicated to be of a small nature, nonetheless, people died, and the balance between the two sides had to be struck and a truce negotiated. Alice Lee petitioned Mara Sod, who had been part of the acolyte camp, to find her mother, who was a skilled negotiator and could broker the peace. The mother of Mara and Aldrin, who had been returned to life as Aldrin, saw through Mara James, however, and saw part of the truth, which was that Mara, not the Diatherm, was the source of the acolyte movement. The Diatherm was merely a pawn. This was part of the truth, but not the whole truth, a truth that was known only to Mara for a great deal of time. The monarchy of the Awoken would in time reign in power, and a new group of scholars would come to be the most influential body of rulers. They were known as the Jensen scribes, some of whom still persist in the warlock orders of today. The scribes who would routinely send Jensen knights on missions to test the reality that they had been studying knew that Mara and Aldrin were gathering lore and prophecy pointing towards the potential day when the acolytes would be proven correct, and when the Awoken would need to repay their debt. The Jensen scribes knew that this could cause another Theodicy war, and so when a tall, strong warrior named Sir Igo walked into the court of the scribes and demanded the knowledge necessary to hunt and kill Mara for her supposed murder of the Diatherm, the Jensen scribes obliged, and gave Sir the knowledge she would need to hunt down Mara. However, a second Awoken queen was rising to prominence in the Awoken monarchy. Ngora Pin, received a cloaked and masked woman in her court one day, whispered by some to be Mara and others to be the diadem. Whatever the case, it mattered not, for after a long time of having the cloaked figure reside within her court, the monarch declared herself a true acolyte. She bound the ambition and knowledge of the gentle scribes to the acolyte's preferred task, and so the scribes set about on the course of attempting to understand if the Awoken owed the cosmos a debt or not. The royal palace was turned into a center of learning and a feast of ideas that radically advanced the acolyte cause. Into this feast strode Sieur Ido, her cloak and longbow at her side. She was looking for the hooded figure. She believed that hooded figure to be Mara, and so she followed her to a laboratory, deducing that this would now be the time to draw her weapon. However, as she was about to kill Mara, she saw her face and was bewitched by her beauty and her grace, and this quelled Sieur's desire to see vengeance for the diadem that she believed Mara had defeated and killed. She threw the weapon between them and told Mara that she could not bring herself to kill, but that the debt of her battle needed to be paid. She would fight Mara to the agony or die crying, and so Mara called upon Odrin, her brother, who would battle upon her behalf. Odrin suggested not one but 3 duels, with blade, rifle, and 5th-generation air superiority fighter. These duels and the prospect of Mara's murder troubled the Jensen scribes, as they did not want to appear to have invited murder upon the one who had extensively informed the beliefs of the Queen. It would be like killing her priest or her closest confidant. They retreated from the acolyte's mission and from the Queen's court, and as the scribes fled the palace in droves, many key contractors in a mission to understand if the acolytes were correct or not sensed hesitation and withdrew their support too. To this, Queen Imperial King denounced the scribes and called them faithless and selfish, which only further deepened the tensions between the sanguine who believed that the covenant was complete and the acolytes, who were even more doubtful than ever of the seventh verdict. The political tension continued to deepen as Odrin and Sieur held their duels. The first duel was held with knives and pitted Sieur's simpler, strong jabs against Odrin's whirling theatre of the blade. But they were equally matched, and a draw was called. In the second challenge, the two chose long rifles and hunted each other for days throughout the jungle, whilst Odrin blended in and used his stealthy abilities to hide and stake out the fight. Sieur simply let her blunt nature disturb the wildlife around her, which appropriately disrupted and revealed Odrin. She shot him as he crossed the riverbed, wounding him, but not killing him. For the final challenge, the two chose 5th-generation fighters, with the full complement of weapons available to either of them. If the full complement could not be supplied, most crucially, it would be simulated instead, and if a simulated kill was attained, it was worth equal value to that of a real kill. Not all weapons were available. In particular, a nuclear payload was not something that the Awoken had kept around, having disposed of those weapons a long time before. Sieur chose an Armory tactical fighter with a payload of heat-seeking missiles, and Odrin chose a ship known as a Dart, which was an exceedingly old fighter with terrible onboard systems that would be easily outmatched by the faster Armory. Sieur might have been able to sense that something was wrong at this point, but regardless, accepted the duel, and 8 miles out from engaging Odrin in the middle of the sky, Sieur's computer informed her that in a simulated manner, Odrin had killed her. In fact, he had killed her and everything in a 4-mile radius. Long ago, during an age when the Dart was constructed, the Awoken had used military-grade ship-to-ship nuclear payloads on the Dart. This was still a part of its payload, and Odrin had simulated firing one of these, and by the result, had ended the duel, and in a simulated manner killed Sieur. After all their fighting, and after all the immense desire for revenge that Sieur held, the two were tied. Sia threw herself before Mara, informing her that she had fought to a standstill with Ocean. Sia left her face in Mara's hands, and Mara lifted her face, telling her to join them and to be of service to her. And so Sia did, and from that day forth until her dying day, served at the right hand of Mara Sol. Later, Mara would meet with Ngoya Pin, and Ngoya would inform Mara that she was abdicating the throne. Mara had manipulated the monarchy and the Jansen scribes to ensure that her needs, both scientific and political, had been accomplished, and Ngoya knew this. This was a rebuke, as much as one could be made against Mara, but it was already too late. Mara had accomplished her purpose, and was even planning ways to implement the monarch who would supplant Ngoya. After some more time passed, Mara finally put her plan into action. She proposed to the Awoken people and her followers that the hour of their reckoning was at hand, and that the time to repay their debt to the cosmos had come. Thousands flocked to Mara's banner, and an expeditionary force was formed, creating the basis for a journey by the Awoken people into space, back through the black hole, back to where they had come from. The expedition was 12.1 billion years in the making. The time was slower within the black hole. When they would emerge, hopefully not much time would have passed at all. Mara had been preparing for this moment ever since she had been reborn. Before she departed, there were two things she had to do. The first was to ask for a boon from the first queen, Alice Lee, and the second was to say goodbye to her mother one last time. The mother who would not be joining Mara on the voyage back to Sol. In spite of all her power, and all her plans and all her manipulations, Mara could not bring her mother with her. She could not convince her to change her ways. Her mother was happy, and did not wish to change her life. And Mara knew no matter how much they argued, she could not be swayed. She tried nonetheless, and their final words were bitter and unresolved. But this was nothing compared to the loss that Mara would experience at the hands of Alice Lee as they spoke later. When Mara arrived, she endeavored to tell Alice Lee the truth, and for this truth that she would tell, the boon that she would ask of Alice Lee was forgiveness. Alice Lee had long suspected that Mara was behind the Awoken people being so divided, so riven. She believed Mara to be the one who had influenced the diaphragm and the acolytes into creating a society that would always have a discontented few, feeling guilt in their debt to the universe. But she could not possibly imagine the scale and brilliance of Mara's design. Mara told her the terrible truth, that Alice Lee only believed herself to be the first being in existence in the new world of the distributory. And she only believed herself to be the first because Mara had desired it to be that way. For it was Mara who had been the first to cross the event horizon that led to the distributory. Mara who had designed the world and all its flaws. Mara who had planted the division in the Awoken people. Mara who had been the devil that had invented suffering and invited it into the Garden of Eden that was the distributory. All this so that 12.1 billion years later she could enact the plan that she had set into motion, so that she could take the skeptics and the guilty and lead them back through the singularity to help fight the cosmic war that had birthed them, so that their debt to the cosmos could be repaid. It was this, the creation of suffering within a perfect world, the first sin within the distributory, the manifestation of evil that Mara asked for forgiveness for. Forgiveness was not what she received from Alice Lee. It was only fury. It was time for Mara and the expedition to depart at long last. The Awoken were returning to the place of their true birth. Before they left the world of the distributory, there was an alert. Retribution of some form had come for them. Missiles from the surface of the distributory's planet were being launched, and Mara initiated an emergency launch back through the singularity Despite the slew of missiles damaging some of the ships, the crews made it mostly unharmed. But Mara was unable to send a final message to her mother, and so she would never know any more from the women that had raised her. But now was not the time for sorrow. Now Mara needed resolve. She returned through the singularity and emerged back in Sol. On the other side, they were greeted by a system in ruin. The collapse had taken its toll, and Sol was mostly unrecognizable. The once mighty domain of humanity was left shattered and lawless, left in squalor, and without hope of salvation or nobility. Whether Mara and the Awoken owed the debt to the cosmos was a subject of debate that one could potentially hold for 12.1 billion years, but the reality before them demanded a response now. Humanity was on its last legs, and undoubtedly the Awoken could help. Initially they settled within the asteroid belt, around a massive string of ships, broken but tethered together near Vesta. This was a closeness that originally had kept them alive, and in the end, this was something that would serve the new life of the Awoken. This would now be their new domain, the reef. As they settled, Kel'Varaj and the other Uteks who accompanied them, now known as Tekkens, divined that some kind of magic had followed them through, and that the Awoken were giving off a strange series of effects, best described as magic, though besides the powers of the universe, mathematics, gravity, just in the same way the darkness and light did, but tied to neither. Some Awoken were capable of this acausal effect and others were not, but the effect was strongest around Mara. The Awoken would then also endure a series of attacks by the Elixni, who had succeeded in following the traveller from their system of origin all the way to its final resting place in Sol. The Awoken fought them back when they attacked. Mara and Aldrin and Swirl led the charge every time. Zura's might, Aldrin's speed, and Mara's raw power delivered the Awoken to victory. It was around this time, however, that Mara would also be petitioned by the Awoken for the right to leave the fleet of ships in the reef and to immediately aid the remnants of humanity. Mara's plan involved them building up a base of power in secret so they could better understand the system before them. The Awoken who wished to leave immediately, however, grew tired of this, and after one craft made a break for it, Mara's own wish was that the Awoken should be given a choice. In all fairness, she had no other options. Mara stated that they were given one chance, and that if they chose to leave, they would not be permitted to return. And so the once riven Awoken were riven again, and those that were parted for the world of humanity would be of great assistance, but they would no longer be known as the Reefborn Awoken. They would be known as the Earthborn Awoken. Thus, a great people was sundered twice. The Earthborn Awoken that went out into the system were greeted by horrors present to the collapse and the following age of darkness that came with it. They would help to rebuild, but there was no longer a system in which they could see humanity flourishing immediately. The Golden Age was gone, and when the Awoken had returned, humanity had spun into a new age of existence, a dark age, when all but the faintest of hopes had been snuffed out. At the end of the collapse, and the start of this new dark age of humanity, the world was left in utter chaos. Whilst some small groups had survived in underground bunkers, such as those fortunate enough in the Black Armory, and whilst others had managed to evade destruction in the wilds, most of humanity lay dead at the hands of the terrible power that invaded the system and challenged the traveller. We were now left shattered and broken, with no clear means of communication with our outer colonies, and with all in-system trade scuttled. humanity was cut off and helpless. Only on Earth did anyone really face any prospect of survival or salvation. Not only did humanity face the constant pressing troubles of starvation and exposure, but they also now shared their worlds with a series of strange and deadly forces from many other reaches of the universe. The Vex, that had once been found on Venus, had surfaced on Mars and Mercury as well, and had utterly transformed Mercury from a garden world into one that was now entirely mechanical, with at least a portion of it hollowed out into a giant simulation engine known as the Infinite Earth. Aside from the Vex, a military power known as the Cabal had also sent 5 of its legions to secure Mars, and to set up a base of operations there so they could launch campaigns into the rest of the system. The 5 legions, the Sand Eaters, Dust Giants, Speech Dancers, Blind Legion, and Skyburners fought ferociously, knowing that they could only return home if they completed their mission here. Whilst on Mars they also began to contest the Vex for ownership of the world, but the Vex descended in great numbers, descending almost more fiercely than they did at any other place. The Elixir had also followed the Traveller into Sol, and were now known as the Fallen by the facets of humanity that encountered them, and they spread throughout the system from the Jovian moons to Venus to Earth, with several major houses such as the House of Devils and House of Winter laying claim to vast tracts of land within the territories that were once humanity's. Earth's Cosmodrome in particular was a point of great infestation, and finally arrived the Vanguard of Oryx's hive, with the Hidden Swarm, Blood of Oryx, and Storm of Crota all taking root within Luna. They dug deep into our moon and prepared for yet another one of their grand conquests, creating a shadowy, subterranean fortress known as the Heimdall, in a region formerly known as the Ocean of Steam. This would burrow so deep into the core of the moon that no light could reach its deepest recesses. These alien forces would help to set the world into chaos, and in the Dark Age, almost nobody could consider themselves to be safe from the conflict that had engulfed all the worlds of humanity. It was at this time that the first of the Light-Bearers began to rise and stake their claim in the world around them. These earliest Guardians were not truly Guardians. They were tyrants who saw their newfound immortality as a tool to be abused, as well as their like. There was no duty for them, and all they sought to do was to wage war for whatever they could get their hands on. Many of them would acquire valuable weapons and assets throughout the system, and for a time, humanity's only source of hope would instead be a source of tyranny. But that is not to say that all of the risen Light-Bearers were conquerors or villains. Amongst their number rose an order of men and women who would be amongst the first to hold to the true duty of the risen, to protect humanity, and to serve the light. These would be the warriors of legend who challenged and eventually defeated the warlords of Earth. They were known as Iron Lords, and the first four amongst their number swore on the day of their founding that they would be protectors and guardians of the people of Earth. And so, Radagast, Perun, Yoda, and Saladin represented some of the first true saviors of humanity. However, defending humanity was not an easy task. Much of them had been disconnected and were lost, broken in the terrible calamity that was the collapse. But as we always have, we survived and collected together, sometimes into small towns such as those most fabled places of Palmon or Coyote, who planted their flags and endeavored to make a living off of what remained of the system's bounty. But the greatest gathering of all was that of a massive camp of refugees that flocked to beneath the Traveller, to the place of its final titanic battle against the darkness. The camp began as a simple thing, defended by a few risen and huddled for warmth around fires and in furs. In such a fearful place, disillusion brewed quickly into adversity. Rudimentary factions began to rise with differing outlooks on the best way to control and run this would-be camp. These factions grew until eventually Risen forces backed them on either side, and with them involved, conflict eventually broke out in the form of what would be known as the faction wars, with some among the Risen, however, seeking to end the violence. It was in this moment that the Fallen attacked the camp. The factions were broken, but the Risen, who had backed them on either side of the divide, all united and collapsed upon the Fallen with terrible power. The Fallen were repelled, and the new factions were left broken. However, this was a lesson, and the Guardians sought to see that this could never happen again, for this was truly the first point at which they could be called Guardians. For after all, had they not simply accomplished their duty to defend humanity against the invaders of the system? From this conflict, a new system of governance was born. It would be impossible to stop the factions from existing, and so the Consensus was created, as well as the Vanguard. The Consensus was a council of both the Vanguard and many represented factions, all of which would be able to submit proposals to the future, a leader of sorts who had arisen with the supposed ability to speak to the traveler. The Vanguard was something entirely different, though. The Vanguard was a part of the Consensus, but they were a council of 3 Guardians, one from each discipline: Hunter, Titan, and Warlock. With them, the Guardians would be represented, and with them, they would be officially classified, and so at last, laws were passed and enacted, and a government with clear authority in hand was born. With it, the turmoil of the people began to cease, and what was once a small camp of refugees beneath the traveler began to grow and blossom, first into a settlement, and then into a bastion. The final bastion beneath our broken god. They would call it the Last City. But this Last City would not stand without challenges or foes to make them. The most persistent threat was either that of the Fallen, with their lightning-fast raiding parties and their unwavering ferocity. Though the offensives would start as small acts of piracy, they would eventually grow into a perpetual siege that would be as defining a characteristic of life within the city as the very air they breathed. The siege in itself, and the very notion of the Fallen continually attacking the city's walls, was nicknamed the 100-Year Siege, for it seemingly never ended. However, to counteract this perpetual threat, the Titans of the city came up with a solution in the form of a series of walls that encompassed the city. As the walls were built, the great defensive installations were placed along their length, including 8 towers, of which now none remain. It was the hope that such a great deterrent, bristling with both the light-bringing Guardians and the death-bringing emplacements of guns, would be enough to keep the citizens of the Last City safe from the Fallen. However, the problem was not one that could be solved by high walls and terrifying fortifications, for the Fallen were driven not just by anger, but by a desperate faith. Their true prize was not the eradication of the city or its inhabitants, but the reclamation of the Great Machine, or as we know it, the Traveler. The Fallen had been seeking it out across the dark vacuum of space in full desperation, and imagine their jealousy to understand that when they found it, not only had it been destroyed and was in the possession of humans, but that those humans had not only been gifted with their own golden age, as the Elixir had, but also now were filled with the ranks of Guardians, those who could truly use the Great Machine's power. No, such transgressions were intolerable, and this drove the Fallen to the kind of zeal that only madness of the desperate would dare to invite and entertain. It was then that the Fallen of the House of Devils, with its strongholds located predominantly in Europe, Asia Minor, and Old Russia, struck out in a combined attack on the city. This would be one of the first true tests of the city's resolve, as the Devils brought their terrifying soldiers and artillery to bear, truly living up to their name. But the Titans of the city had prepared an answer. It was not some secret weapon aside from their light, it was not some great strategy, it was simply to hold the line. The 4 orders of Titans, including those such as the Firebreak Order and the Pilgrim Guard, held the 6 approaches to the city in a coordinated defense against the invaders. A great attack was made, and as it was reported, there was a chance to charge, but the Titans, including those amongst their order thirsty for blood, held to discipline and held the line. The battle was long and fierce. The fallen outnumbered them to an almost comical extent, but the Guardians had the light on their side, and when fighting together, even when outnumbered and overrun, they were seemingly unstoppable, and the waves of attacking fallen broke upon them with ease. The Titans that day held back the fallen on 6 different fronts, and not a single one of those fronts had broken. This would be the first great victory for humanity in the Dark Age, and this would be the first time the city had ever been defended against a truly overwhelming foe. It would be forever remembered as the Battle of the 6th Front, and this battle was such a great honor to Titans that it remains represented in their heraldic iconography to this very day, with Titan hexagonal designs calling back to this and always being divided into 4. But it was not merely Titans that made up the defenses of the city on this day. One of the most prominent sets of heroes that rose also included a warlock by the name of Osiris. The Titan Saint 14 witnessed his incredible skill in battle, seeing that he was almost seemingly in more places than one at any single point in the battle. And it was at this point that Saint 14, who was closely allied himself with the Speaker, recommended that Osiris should be elevated to the Vanguard warlock position. The relationship of the Speaker and Saint 14 was so close that they referred to each other as father and son, and at Saint's recommendation the Speaker obliged, and Osiris was proclaimed the new warlock Vanguard. The only dissenting voice of this decision was that of Lysander and the Concordate, a faction that believed Osiris to be a mistake, a misincarnation or a faulty resurrection by a ghost. The victory at 6 fronts marked not only the end of the first great test for humanity, but also marked the beginning of a new age, where hope blossomed once again in earnest. This would be the end of humanity's dark age, where before they had cowered in huddled masses beneath the Traveller and prayed for deliverance. With the Iron Lords, with the Guardians, with the city, that deliverance had come. Now was the time for humanity to stand once more and to begin to fight back. This was to many amongst the number of the Guardians the birth of what would be known as the City Age. The City Age may be named after the city, but one of the most important things to know about the City Age is merely to do with the incomplete nature of humanity's knowledge. At the time being, there were no dates, no timelines, and of course, our idea of what was blurred and partially incomplete. Such is the nature of the post-apocalyptic era, and there is no real consensus therefore on when the City Age truly began. For some, it was at the victory at 6 fronts, for others the formation of the walls, and for a few still, it was at the creation of the camp beneath the Traveller. But regardless, the City Age began, and it played host to ballads of legends, myth, and incredible adventure. The city would expand and grow into a powerful bastion of humanity, and the Guardian Orders would press out into the solar system and commit the brave deeds of heroism. However, the first event that is noted in the timeline of the City Age that is of real significance is that of a terrifying purge of some of the most majestic and dangerous creatures within the system. It would start with the event known by the Guardian Orders as the Great Hunt. But in order to better understand the Great Hunt, we need to start in the reef, not the city. Back in the Dark Age, when the Awoken had just been split into the Earth and Reefborn, Mara instructed Ogren to go out into the system and to discover for her a unique source of power. Ultron returned with what is known as a wish dragon, an Ahamkara. Ahamkara are dragons, both sentient and intelligent enough to speak, bargain, and deceive. But this was not the only thing that made the Ahamkara extraordinary. Ahamkara were shapeshifters, capable of growing massive or minuscule in size on a whim, and also had access to a special kind of magic, known as wish magic. This power, as best we know, holds no allegiance to the light or dark, but it manipulates the threads of fate and the fabric of the universe in a similar manner to the power of the light and the dark. It was not some stupendous power capable of crushing atoms, but instead it was a subtle thing that could manipulate the universe without necessarily invoking its physics. Wish magic was named such because it relied on preying on the ambitions and desires of those not strong-willed enough to contest the Ahamkara. The Queen and the dragon Ultron recovered eventually forged a bond, and the young Ahamkara would come to name itself Riven, in honor of the twice-riven people that was the Awoken. More Ahamkara flocked to the reef, and Awoken society began to revolve around them. It is here that wish magic and the incredible designs of the Awoken came together to create what is known as the Dreaming City, a sacred place for the Awoken, hidden within the stars of the reef itself. In this place, the Ahamkara and the Awoken lived in relative harmony. All seemed peaceful, but the Awoken Queen knew that the Ahamkara could be found all over the system, and that the unique power she had sought was not in fact so unique. But this was not to be forever. She would soon have that unique source of power. It was at this time that the city also began to encounter the dragons, and at which point they realized the danger that they posed. The bargains struck with the Ahamkara had granted the Guardians great power and wisdom and information that was crucial to their campaigns, but had also always come at a terrible cost. This was the nature of wish magic. For every wish granted, there was a terrible, twisted reality to it, one that would always come at the cost of the Guardians themselves or someone around them. With their presence becoming a threat to the safety of the city itself, it was decreed by the consensus that the beasts should be hunted down and made extinct. And so the great hunt began, with the city even quietly petitioning the Awoken monarchy for aid. This aid was granted to them in the forms of weapons to hunt the beasts, although this aid was even secretly made available at the request of Riven. Perhaps Riven was fulfilling Mara's wish for some source of power that the wishes always grant the Ahamkara, or perhaps for some unique advantage. But regardless, many great warriors took up the weapons of the Awoken and the city, and took part in the hunt, or at least the process of it. Many terrible final wishes were made by the beasts and their assailants. Some of the scars of those wishes can still be seen today. Though, as with all things to do with wish magic, there are many details that are unclear, or as of yet, unproven. Regardless, the Ahamkara were hunted to the very brink of extinction, with only Riven surviving, trapped within the fortified citadel at the heart of the Dreaming City, in a place known as the Queen's Walk. With that, the only way the Ahamkara could communicate to us was through their remains, which held some of their latent power. But for the most part, it would be generations, even hundreds of years, before the Guardians saw another Ahamkara ever again. However, it was not just the Ahamkara that would start to see their end in this time. The days of the Iron Lords were also numbered. They had continued to exist and to defend the city as they grew in number, sending out Guardians from their base of operations on Felwinter Peak. The Order had grown to at least 100 in number, but Radagast lamented that whilst he and his Iron Lords could defend humanity and watch over the vast tracts of Earth, they could not so easily return humanity to its golden age of technology. But when Lord Timur, a warlock of the Iron Lords, discovered records of the lost golden age technology of Siva, Radagast leapt into action. The nanotechnology could potentially rebuild the marvels that humanity had lost, and with it at their command, there was the potential for them to do even more incredible things. When the location of the technology's whereabouts had been discovered, particularly the replication complex in the northeastern section of the Cosmodrome, every one of the Iron Lords descended on that part of the world in force, hell-bent on claiming the technology for humanity. It was discovered that the billions upon billions of Seaver nanites were still under the command of a fragment of the warmind Rasputin, and in a moment it would resound throughout the ages. The infamous Iron Lord warlock known as Felwinter attempted to commune with the shard of Rasputin. However, for reasons not truly understood, the warmind sent its response in the form of a 3-word command to the millions of nanites of Seaver. This command would spell doom for the Iron Lords, so laid claim to this ancient technology. Those words: replicate, eliminate, immunize. And so full of fury that only a weapon such as Seaver could contain, Seaver's nanites were unleashed upon the Iron Lords. The battle was one of terrible proportions, and it was suddenly clear that if Seaver was not contained, it was liable to overrun the Cosmodrome, and from there, who knows what it could do. 9 Iron Lords made a push for the replication complex, where the source of the Seaver nanites could be found. But after much fierce fighting, it was clear that all hope was lost without great sacrifice. Lady Yoda took it upon herself to seal the replication complex with 7 other Iron Lords and herself inside, whilst also detonating an explosive device that contained the outbreak at Seaver. The only Iron Lord to survive the replication complex was Lord Saladin, and the battle outside in the Cosmodrome had seen all the other Iron Lords slaughtered, with the exception of Lady Ephrodite, who went on a path of exile and pacifism from that day onward. The area of the Cosmodrome containing Seaver was, from this point onwards, quarantined, and from that day forth the region would now be known as the Plague Land, for the mechanical plague that lay dormant beneath its surface. Lord Saladin would wait and watch, holding silent vigil over the plague, until the day that he might finally be needed again, to finally bring rest to those Iron Lords that had been lost. Meanwhile, back in the city, trouble was starting to brew. Osiris, the new warlock Vanguard, was descending into a deep and secluded study of the Vex. He knew that other threats to the city, such as the Fallen, did exist, but his research had left him convinced that the Vex represented the greatest present danger to the forces of the city and to the Guardian Orders. These beliefs brought him into contention with the rest of the consensus, and in particular, the Speaker. When Osiris sought to publish his findings in order to arm the people of the city with knowledge, the people instead took to them not as scientific study or fact or even merely as speculation by a scholar. Instead, they took to them as prophecy. Such was the cult of Osiris's personality. The Speaker then saw this as an attempt to radicalize and split the population of the city between those that supported Osiris and those that supported the consensus. The Speaker even took to the extreme measure of burning the prophecies of Osiris, and began to speak of the once revered warlock as though he was a curse. One day, the Speaker called the consensus to order and declared that Osiris was a tumor to an otherwise healthy body, and called for a motion to exile the warlock. It was at this moment, however, that Osiris entered the hall of the consensus and accepted the decision wholeheartedly. Osiris left the city and headed out into the territories of the Vex so he could fight them on their own ground. But what Osiris could not take with him was the impact that he made upon the city and its people. This was irreversible, and would sow the first seeds of dissent against the Vanguard, the city, and the consensus. Seeds that perhaps can still be felt to this day, seeds that perhaps have dwindled and died, but regardless, Osiris's cult would leave a mark. There was, however, little time for this disunity amongst the people and the guardians of the city. A foe on the horizon that was all too familiar was beginning to raise its ugly head, and all of the forces of the city would need to muster in order to face it. The fallen houses were starting to coordinate and gather their forces. Whilst this would sound innocuous to some, this would be correctly identified by the hunter scouts in the employable Vanguard as all too terrible an occurrence. The fallen houses were normally fiercely territorial and would fight amongst themselves to maintain the status quo, but for them all to be collaborating meant that they needed to unite under a common cause, and this could only be one thing: the Great Machine. Having seen the House of Devils so firmly rebuked by the city at the Battle of the Six Fronts, it was clear to the Fallen that it would take the forces of more than just a single house to have any chance of breaking the city and claiming the Great Machine for their own. And so the four greatest houses in the system came together with a united purpose: to reclaim their heritage lost in the whirlwind by right of war. The House of Devils, Kings, Winter, and Wolves collected their forces and made plans to converge on the city as a united armada that would blot out the stars with their numbers. Millions of fallen were assembled for what was quite possibly the most colossal battle in the history of the city. It was believed that with their combined might, the houses would be unstoppable, and that united under a joint banner they would not only reclaim the Great Machine, but also destroy their bitter human rivals, once and for all. The battle for the city that would take place that day would be known as the Battle of the Twilight Gap. The city prepared for the attack, and the defense was organized by 3 Titans. Lord Saladin led the defenses, and was in command of all deployments of the forces of the city. His 2 commanders would be given specific forces and would be able to assist in holding the wall from the front lines. The fighting was ferocious, and it appeared as though the Fallen had humanity backed into a corner as the forces of the Devils, Winter, and Kings pushed hard against the Twilight Gap, a small segment of fortifications that was being quickly overrun. Saladin saw this and was dismayed, calling for all forces to fall back to the next district. Lord Shax, who was at the Twilight Gap, saw this and could not abide by such a notion, for he knew that falling back could very well mean the doom of the city. He was left with a choice. He could either obey orders and fall back to the city, or he could hold his ground and defend the Twilight Gap with everything that he had left. In that moment, Shax held the fate of the last safe city and of all of humanity in his hands. And luckily for us, he chose to disobey his orders. He called his fire team, including the fabled gunslinger Armory, the Sunbreaker weapons crafter known as Wu Feng, and 3 other guardians known as Keshi-32, Abdi, and Truth. Together the 6 of them fought, back to back, side by side, dying over and over, defending the very soil for the hallowed place that it was. For this was the last bastion of hope, and they would defend it until the last of their light was spent. The Fire Great Order would have been proud. They had stood their ground and chosen a place upon which it would be worthy for them to die. But they would not fall, and after enough time had passed, the other defenders were able to reorganize and create a counterattack. The reinforcements included Andal Brask, the Hunter Vanguard, and Commander Zavala, the other sub-commander of the city's forces. Now reunited with their fellow guardians, they would begin to sweep back the tide of fallen, and with that, any chance of the fallen claiming the traveler was snuffed out for good. Lord Shax, with his decisions in that split second, had saved the last safe city. This represented a landmark moment for the city. Not only was it truly a stellar victory for the forces of the city over the fallen, but it set into motion a spirit of indomitable confidence within the Guardian Orders. The fallen had gathered the full measure of their might to contest to the city, and in spite of those close odds, the attack had been squarely repelled. Shax, however, would feel repercussions of this day. Him, Zavala, and Saladin would never quite be friends again, thanks to his insubordination on that day. Regardless, Shax would gain a level of prestige that was unparalleled, and would go down in the history of the city as a living legend. But the cost of this victory would also be immense. Many legendary guardians had fallen that day, and the ranks of those that remained were stretched thin. Amongst those supposedly lost was Armory, who had been seen by Zavala falling from the city after being assailed by a fallen captain. The city mourned for the losses, but in a way it also made the city stronger, as the loss brought a series of actions from the city's citizens and guardians that proved its own resolve. Many attempts were made to honor the heroic guardians that had fallen that day, but the most notorious of these attempts was not some statue commissioned or a bank of flowers left in the tower. Instead, it was the creation of two genius inventors known as Fatal Crux and Victor Lomar of the Crux Lomar Foundries. They were responsible for creating much of the city's heavy ordnance, and with this goal of honoring the guardians that had fallen that day in mind, there was a pure intent that they had realized, and they thought of the development of a new weapon through what would be known as Project Heimdall. This would involve the melting down of the armor of those guardians lost at the Battle of Twilight Gap. They would then see that armor reforged into one of the most infamous weapons in the history of humanity, the Yarahorn shoulder-mounted launcher system. Not only did it contain revolutionary technology in the form of the Wolfpack rounds, but it also howled with the fury of the guardians that had fallen that day, fighting back not just with the explosive fire that one would expect, but also with the light of those guardians that had fallen. Others still honored those that had fallen that day with actions that were more direct. Saint 14 was the most notorious amongst them, and took it upon himself to personally conduct the Great Crusade. These were great attacks against the fallen that he undertook alone. These campaigns were incredibly successful, and as time went on, each of the houses were beaten back. Eventually, the Crusades were so successful that Saint 14 found himself dueling with Sulkis, the Carol of the House of Devils. Sulkis eventually held the Titan in a choking grip, and it was almost to the point where Saint was defeated. But the Titan rolled back his shoulders and head, with every ounce of strength remaining, and used it to headbutt the Carol of the fallen House of Devils so hard that the Carol's skull caved in, killing him instantly. Saint 14 stood, alive and victorious. Saint was then contacted by the Speaker, and although the Speaker wished him to return home, having heard news of Osiris being spotted on Mercury, Saint headed out there to find him, and was never seen again. However, what is overlooked by some is that the glorious victory at Twilight Gap would have been impossible without the intervention of another infamous figure within the system, namely the Awoken Queen of the Reef, Mara Sal. She saw the fallen communicating with each other across the system, and it was the House of Wolves that had disturbed her. Their fleet had gathered from the Jovian moons and was making a resupply run at the asteroid of Ceres, which lay squarely in Awoken territory. The Queen had two possible choices. Either she could allow the fallen to pass by and keep the reef a secret from the rest of the system, or she could engage the fallen wolves at her door and destroy them, whilst exposing the reef to everyone in Sol. A choice between secrecy and publicity, a choice between peace and war, and Mara chose war. What followed was a series of campaigns and skirmishes that involved both the Awoken of the Reef and the various factitious parts of the House of Wolves. It would culminate in a battle between Mara's forces and the newly appointed Wolf Cow Scolus the Rabbit. The war might have been yet bloodier and might even have been lost, but the fallen were betrayed by a House of Judgment scribe known as Varric the Loyal. He was in service to Scolus, and allowed the Awoken a critical advantage, which let them capture Scolus finally. He was sent to languish in the prison of elders, along with many of his truly faithful fallen wolves, but in the prison of elders there was no potential to grow, and so some of the wolves swore loyalty to the Vestian dynasty of Mar-Sol. They would eventually, of course, betray her, but for a time, the fallen and the awoken lived together in the reef in harmony. Meanwhile, in the ranks of the Guardians, Osiris's teachings would not go without having an impact still. Sacred was not the only one who was seemingly obsessed with the old warlock master, and having heard of the power of the Vex from his teachings, there were others that sought to fight against this terrible foe. And it was then that three Guardians, known as Prodis, Pahanin, and Kabir the Legionless, would attempt to enter the Vault of Glass and defeat the terrifying Vex presence within. However, they severely underestimated the power of the Vex's defenses within the vault, which, despite seeming like nothing more than a large cave network, was in fact a giant fortress, and the site of some of their greatest experiments with time. Within the time screens, they could do more than simply destroy the Guardians with their immense firepower. They could manipulate time as a weapon. The Guardians faced what were known as the Oracles in the vault, Vex supercomputers capable of isolating an individual within time, and unless they asserted dominance over it, removing them entirely. Understand what this means. You don't simply die. To be found wanting by an oracle, to be stunned by the ritual of negation, is to have never existed at all. Such was the power of the Vex in the vault. In the face of such power, the Guardians were helpless. The Hyper-Pahanin fled, and the warlock Prodis was locked deep in the confines of the vault, lost in its time stream. However, it was Kabir the Legionless who would face the most gruesome fate of all. Kabir was drunk of the radiolaria of the Vex oracles, and this meant that his body slowly began to be corrupted as he himself was changed into the Vex. He would lose control over his body and brain, and before they took him entirely, Kabir forged a mighty shield known as the Aegis. It is into this shield that he poured all of his light, so that if other Guardians might come through the vault, they might have a source of power that could be used to break the Vex's hold over time. The first raid on the Vault of Glass was a failure, and Kabir the Legionless was no more. But this would not be the last adventure that the Guardians would see in the Vault of Glass. Meanwhile, in the city, factional differences within the consensus were beginning to intensify, and Lysander, the leader of the faction known as the Concordat, declared war upon the Vanguard and the Speaker, although his reasons for doing so are not well recorded or understood. This upheaval led to a final confrontation between the New Monarchy and the Concordat in the tower that is known as Bannerfall, and this effectively ended their membership of the consensus and their general part in the city's life. In their place, another faction known as the Future War Cult was promoted to the rank of full consensus member. Around this time, the consensus records also make the first real mention of Lord Shax and his Crucible, the objective of which was simply to allow Guardians to train by fighting each other. Guardians had long had a habit of fighting and settling differences through combat, but Shax's Crucible formalized to the practice and acted as a temporal flame to the blaze that was the young Guardians entering the ranks that had so recently been filled with heroes. The Crucible over time became more and more engraved in the city's culture, and eventually became a televised sport within the city, with residents placing bets and supporting their favored Guardians or clan-based teams with incredible vigor, just as one might support any other sporting team today. The games led to a sense of honor and chivalry for most, because even as the Guardians fought each other, they made each other stronger in the process. But that strength would still not be enough to stop the most aggressive of adversaries. It had been some time since the attack on Twilight Gap, and the Fallen had not made another assault on the city in some time. However, this was not to say that the Fallen weren't still a menace. Long prior to Twilight Gap, The wilds were haunted by the whispers of a fallen mercenary called Tanix the Scarred, who was a gun for hire amongst the fallen, one who would pursue guardian targets in particular at the behest of those who could pay a handsome price. A mercenary through and through, but a devious one with a mean streak and a habit for destroying guardians entirely. After encountering him in the field, the hunter Andal Brask and his close friend Cade Frith made what would be known as the Vanguard Dare. The first one to kill Tanix would be rewarded with renown and fame. The loser would fill the hunter's vanguard position, a most onerous task for a hunter that desires freedom and the ability to explore. Cade went on to win the contest, killing Tanix, but the problem was that Cade had not simply killed a being of mortal flesh. Tanix was more mechanical than biological, and every death would simply mean his reconstruction. In time, Tanix would find vengeance, and sometime after the fallen had been served to their bitter defeat at Twilight Gap, Tanix would serve vengeance by slaughtering Andal Brask. Feeling guilt and a responsibility for not having been able to kill Tanix, Cade took the place of the Hunter Vanguard in Andal's stead. The loss of the Hunter's Vanguard could have been a deterrent to the consensus and the FOTC generally, but perhaps emboldened by the city's dominant position or believing with hubris that they could reclaim the glory of the Golden Age, they set their sights on a grand military goal. When the first men landed on the moon in the 20th century, they marked themselves as true pioneers of humanity and human civilization. For better or for worse, the consensus sought to emulate their forebears and sought to reclaim the moon from the hive. Some would call it brave, the wise would call it madness. Mere tracks having traced to the hive and the might of their swords before would inform the consensus in no uncertain terms of the mistakes that they were making, pleading with them to call off the attack after having witnessed their power at another smaller skirmish known as the Battle of the Burning Lake. The consensus, however, was unmoved, and the expeditionary army was approved. The city gathered together the first and last army of Guardians to serve on a mass offensive against the alien force in Sol. Over 1,000 Guardians journeyed to the moon and touched down with the intent to claim it from the hive by force. However, in spite of the might of over 1,000 Guardians being present on the moon's surface, the banners of the Cormorant seal would meet stern resistance from the hive. Whilst gains were made at first, and whilst some prisoners were even captured, the Guardians were stopped by an unbreakable champion of the hive, a terrible demon wreathed in green flame, wielding a sword that cracked the surface of the moon with every swing. It was here that the Battle of MyNameIsByf's would be fiercest, and it was here that the Guardians would first face Crota, the Eater of Hope, the son of Oryx. His counter-assault on the Guardian forces was so vicious and complete that it is better remembered as butchery. The Guardian forces had to pull back, having lost many of their number, and so the Battle of MyNameIsByf ended in crushing defeat. As the beleaguered Guardian forces fled the moon's surface, they left behind many dead, and would forever remember the failed assault on the moon by a terrible different name. They would remember it as the Great Disaster. The aftermath of this calamitous event was far-reaching and tragic, but there is one tragedy that rises to prominence above all the others: the tragedy of Eriana III and Wei-Ning. Eriana III was a relic of the Praxic Order, and at MyNameIsByf she had lost her lover, Wei-Ning, a mighty Titan warrior, who at the hands of Crota had been slain. Wishing for revenge, Eriana sought a means by which she could assail the hive and destroy Crota, but she would not receive any assistance from the city following their terrible defeat, as the consensus suspended all cis-lunar Guardian operations and stated that any to step onto the moon's surface did so alone. Eriana's vengeance would have to be attained another way. She was joined in her struggle by a hunter of the hidden, a mysterious organization run by Ikora Ray. This hunter was Eris Morn, and she too was hell-bent on avenging those who had fallen to Crota's blade on the surface of the moon. Together, they knew that in order to defeat their enemy, they needed to understand them, and if they expected any success in this matter, they needed to find someone who knew the Hive better than most. And so it was that they sought out the exiled warlock master of Hive Arcana. They sought out Toland, the Shattered One. His exile was originally due to his heretical beliefs, and his adoption of the Hive's very own sword logic as his core values. He believed that the darkness would be victorious with this simpler, more effective logic of battle. And with Toland at their side, a team began to form. Eris, Toland, and Ariana were joined by two hunters known as Omaragar and Simota, and a mighty titan of the Pilgrim Guard known as Veltalo. Together the fire team would assemble and assault the Hellmouth and take the fight to the Hive. 6 of them would go down into the pit, seeking revenge for those they'd lost, or seeking power locked deep within the Hive fortress. Veltalo was defeated by a mass of thralls that swarmed over him, and though the thralls were weak individually, as a horde, they tore the Titan limb from limb. Simota was lost at the hands of Omnigul, the will of Crota, and the mother of his spawn. Eris was the last to see Omaragar, who had been captured and broken by the Hive, suffering possibly a worse fate than death, for his light was torn from him like flesh from bone, and was fed to a new generation of Crota's spawn. He died in agony so unimaginable that only in the cruel minds of the Hive could it even be contemplated. Ariana III and Toland made it down into the stills at the very bottom of the Hellmouth, and even made it into Crota's ascendant realm, the Oversoul throne. It was here, in the apex of Crota's power, that Toland showed his true colors. He conversed with the death singer Yut, and his curiosity to understand her death song was met with a culling. He was stricken from his mortal body by her power, and his soul was loosed into the ascendant realm, where he would wander the sea of screens, much to his delight, much to his interest. Then, it was only Ariana who stood before the power of the Hive Prince. Her death is not recorded, but it is assumed without a doubt that she perished. This left only one, Eris Morn. Eris, who was now deep in the Hellmouth, and who had lost her sight and her ghost. She should have died at the hands of the Hive, and yet she went on and survived, and stole back her sight, using the eyes of an acolyte as her own, and for hundreds of years she dwelled in the depths of the Hellmouth. With the loss of Mara Ibrahim and the failure of the first fire team to defeat Crota's forces, the city descended once again into an age where darkness seemed very palpable and very terrifying. The forces of the enemy pressed in around us, and the once great power that had radiated from the Guardians had started to wane. The city held its breath as the last tower stood in defiance against the night. Tales once told to frightened children slowly stopped, as the children were frightened anyway. And in the hour of great darkness that had descended upon us, something glimmered. It was not something that the city was unused to, but it was something that it had forgotten. Hope. Hope would find us, and that hope was you. It was now, in a time of great need, that we were risen into this world. But even as we took our first steps, we were in grave danger. After evading the fallen, We found an old Arcadia jump ship, capable of taking us to the last safe city. Guided by our ghost, we made our way past mountains and through storms, and it was here that we were informed of the true mission of every guardian, to push back the darkness and to assist each other and fight for the light. We would go and assist guardians on Earth and beyond, but first we needed to head back to the Cosmodrome to slay Rixus. Rixus was an Archon rising at the House of Devils, and from his remains we claimed a near-light speed drive, which allowed our old jump ship to head out further into the system and to travel to other worlds. It was then that we explored the abandoned Cosmodrome and found not only that the Fallen were trying to break through the firewall with a fragment of the Warmind Rasputin, a fragment of which was located in the Cosmodrome on Earth, but also it was when we discovered a hive nesting ground. This nest had been built into the old Skywatch of Earth, and it was led by a witch who we killed. The ghost handily assumed and deduced that the witch had to have come from the moon. We also reactivated an old array station, unintentionally connecting the fragment of Rasputin to systems all across Sol. Finally, we took on the fallen devils in their home turf, defeating their high servitor, Suffix Prime, and dealing a crippling blow to the house. For a fledgling guardian to accomplish such feats was not unheard of, but it would be wrong to state that we hadn't gained the attention of a few important individuals. Next, we decided to follow up on what we discovered in the Skywatch and ventured out to the moon to discover what was happening and how the hive had made it to Earth. Here we discovered a hive temple known as the Temple of Crota, and after defeating its dark wardens, we retrieved a captured ghost who had died but had learned of a hive plan to invade Earth. Investigating this further led us to infiltrate the hive's fortress known as the Heimdall, where we discovered a hive information database known as the World's Grave. This contained all the knowledge imaginable on the hive and their plans. The World's Grave indicated that the hive had been preparing to unleash their forces on Earth for centuries, and that their plans were nearing fruition. It was our job then to blunt the hive defenses in any manner we could, and from here we then ventured back into the hive fortress for several sorties, the first of which allowed us to destroy the physical manifestation of the hive champion Crota's sword, and venturing deeper into the inner recesses of the fortress allowed us to destroy a shrine to Oryx himself and defeat its guardian, Sardok. Finally, however, we received a desperate communication from the speaker, stating that they believed that the hive were engaged in a ritual that was draining the traveler of its light. We immediately rushed back to the Temple of Crota to infiltrate the fortress once again and stop the ritual. But it was here that we were greeted by a mysterious voice, the Exo-Stranger. She told us that there were worse enemies than the hive, and that we should go down and face them, and that if we survived, we should meet her in the Ishtar Sink on Venus. Having heard the words of the mysterious figure, we successfully stopped the ritual, which as it turns out was draining the life of the traveler through the use of one of its own broken shards. But our job was not complete. Following the warning that there were worse foes than this out in the world, we headed to the Ishtar Sink on Venus, and discovered, for the first time, the Vex. It is here, after slaying them en masse, that we discovered Elsie Bray, better known as the Exo-Stranger. Elsie's identity would be a mystery to us for years to come, and it was only when we would rediscover her sister, Anna Bray, that we would ever get any note from Elsie in particular. But it was worth knowing that Elsie had our back, even if she didn't even have time to explain why she didn't have time to explain. She told us that in order to stop the Vex, and to stop a greater darkness, we needed to head to the Black Garden, where the Vex were born. We were informed that only after defeating the heart of the Black Garden would our traveler begin to heal. The only ones who knew the location of the Black Garden were the Awoken, and so we headed out to the reef to meet them. They were at first very unwilling to work with us, and even greeted us with contempt, but Mara sought an agreement with us. And so Prince Aldrin informed us that we would be allowed to enter the Black Garden only if a key was forged, and in order to do that, the Awoken would need the head of a Vex Gate Lord. And so, we would need to head back to Venus to track one down. In order to do this, we would need to know more about the Vex as a whole, and so we ambushed the Cyclops and stole its mind core, then taking it to a nearby abandoned Ishtar Collective facility to study it. From here we discovered the true nature of the Vex and realized they were capable of traveling through time, and that they could organize and coordinate their attacks across many different timelines within seconds. Following this, we also worked to secure Venus better against the Fallen that had infested it, and it was at this moment that an Ishtar Collective laboratory was being broken into by the House of Winter. The Cryptarch, Master Rahul, convinced us to enter and to defend this place, so that the secrets within could not be stolen by the Vex. It was also here that we learned of the Vault of Glass for the first time. Tracing back the fallen intruders, we discovered a catch belonging to the House of Winter, and boarded it, killing not only many members of its crew, but also its leader, the Kell of the House of Winter. Finally, we went to the Infinite Steps, and besieged the Gate Lord Zydron, taking its head and bringing it back to the Awoken Queen. Prince Aldrin then extracted the eye of the Gate Lord, allowing us to impersonate it and enter the Black Garden. However, the eye itself needed to be charged, and so we were told the location of the Black Garden and sent upon our way. We took the eye with us, knowing that this was our only chance of getting inside. We eventually found the gate to the Black Garden within Meridian Bay's greater region known as the Valley of the Kings. The gate was massive and ominous, and even pulsed with some kind of strange power, but we could not access it immediately. This time, we would need to find more about what was going on, and so we investigated Mars. First we looked more into the Vex, and realized that they were returning home here, and that the Black Garden and Mars were in fact the origin of the Vex. And we also investigated the Dust Palace, a place where the Cabal had been invading and were attempting to co-opt a Warmind system. It was there that we checked the subsystem in question and found that it was occupied by none other than the fragment of Rasputin that we had earlier been facing on Earth. Finally, we discovered a way of charging the Gate Lord's eye and defeating the Primus of the Blind Legion in our quest to utilize a Vex Spire to accomplish this. The Vex Spire was within the heart of Cabal territory, and so we had to raid a heavily armed and defended base, but we were successful nonetheless, and now was our chance to assault the Black Garden for good. As we made our assault, we made our way through copious numbers of Vex frames that were clearly ancient. As we entered the Black Garden, these ancient frames were covered in moss. Such was the way of the Black Garden. It was a place where life flourished. But something dark had infected the heart of this place, and had infected the Vex as well. Not being able to comprehend it, the Vex had taken to worshipping it. This primordial sin that we faced in the heart of the Black Garden was not well understood, but it is best believed to be some festering remnant of the darkness that was dimming the light of the traveler. It was an imposter, an assailant, a villain, and we needed to destroy it. And so we did. It started to slave Vex minds to its will, and it began to awaken mighty Vex champions. But in doing so, it bound itself to these physical forms, and as we defeated each one of them, the heart of the Black Garden began to die. When finally it was destroyed, light returned to the system and the traveler, and the speaker began to call us home. We sat in the tower for but another small moment, and received a mysterious token from the stranger who appeared spontaneously. The token was her rifle, and with that, she told us that there were many other terrible, dark things out in the system. And so, we moved on. But our first few adventures were not just yet completed. There was one more that we would see to: the vengeance of Kabir, Pahanin, and Pradith. The Vault of Glass had lain dormant since that fire team raided its inner depths and was repelled. But it was now our fate to take on this challenge. We descended into darkness, with 5 other guardians, and using the Aegis left behind by Kabir, we defeated the Templar and its oracles, made our way through the Gorgon's labyrinth, and descended into the heart of the vault, finally discovering the glass throne. It was at the heart of this place that we encountered the true power of the Haven Lords. That power was Atheon, Time's consort, a vast frame capable of manipulating the threads of time itself, sending both its minions and us backwards and forwards in time. But with the light, we had learned to wield and express our might, and it showed us clearly one thing: even though Atheon commanded the threads of fate itself, we were guardians, and we were above such petty causality. The guardians sampled the truth of power causality. The power of the light and dark applies to us as well, and we were able to manipulate the fabric of the universe with our very will. Guardians would not have their fate made for them. Guardians would make their own fate. And so Atheon was defeated, and the vault of glass was thundered. At long last, the fire team that had entered so long ago could all be put to rest. But this was only our first adventure, and there were many more on the horizon, the first of which would set up a chain of events that would culminate not only in our strengthening and the renewal of yet more light, but it would result in the death of gods and kings. In our short time as guardians, we had already accomplished what some believed to be impossible. But our duty as guardians had only just begun. It was hardly a few months into our new lives when the first of the many crises that would come our way would rear its ugly head. That challenge was the rising Hive invasion on the moon that would now be spurred into action by its new ascendant champion, the Hive Prince Crota. His horde would rise to start their incursion on Earth, and the invasion would be one of terrible consequences were it not for a single lost soul that returns to us, Eris Morn, the last. She had been lost within the Hellmouth for so long, but with the impending danger of Crota's invasion, she managed to escape, and made her way back to the tower, where she would be able to warn us of the coming invasion. Though Zavala and the Speaker saw her new eyes torn from an acolyte to be a sign of corruption, Ikora Ray, the hidden leader, was pleased to see her agent return alive, and rightly trusted her to remain loyal to the tower in this time of great need. Eris would then direct us in a series of skirmishes and tactical strikes to defeat the invading forces of Crota, and to stop the invasion before it could get worse. First, we were directed to attack Sardon, the fifth of Crota, the commander of his armies on Earth. After breaking him and leaving him warned within the caverns below the Cosmodrome, we then decided to interfere with an attack on the systems of Rasputin that would lead us into a new place known as the Seraphim Vault. If Omnigul and her forces were able to control the Warmind, or even merely disable it, then the victory of the Hive would be almost assured. The battle for the Warmind was brief, and there was a moment at which the might of Crota was summoned into the fray. Omnigul directing this massive ogre's rage in our direction was of no use, however, and the Hive were yet again struck down. And here, there was an opening for a perfect counterattack. Crota's soul was in the process of being summoned forth from the Ascendant Realm so that he could once again lead the armies of the Hive. Now was our opportunity to expel him back into the Sea of Screams, and to deny his assault entirely. We headed deep into the Hellmouth, into one of the darkest chambers, and discovered his lair, and defeated him in our mortal realms. Our task was not yet finished though. Crota would still be able to reach out into our realm with the many appendages of power that he held under his control, the other various hives that languished throughout Earth. Our next task was to sever these servants from our world and to destroy Crota's power in our domain. The greatest of these servants would not be his eyes or his hand or his heart. It would be his will. Omnigul, the mother of his spawn, a hive witch of terrible power. But even she was not powerful enough to stop us. And now, with Crota's power dwindling in the material realm, our war against him could have been considered at least somewhat over. However, there was no guarantee that the minions of Crota, as well as Crota himself, would not simply rise and return in another time. They were a disease festering in the heart of the moon, and we needed to be the fever that would burn them out. But beyond just this, there was not merely the safety of the city to consider. Eris asked us to do one last thing for her, and she asked us to do it so that she might finally see vengeance for her friends and her fire team. So we set out on a journey to raid the depths of the Hellmouth as they once had, and to defeat Crota once and for all. 6 of us went down into the pit, traveling to one of the darkest places in all our worlds, the Stills. The darkness here was complete and oppressed our light at every turn, slowing us so that we might be dragged into the swarm of hive thrall that awaited us. We fought through the darkness, with enemies surrounding us at every interval until we finally arrived at the keyhole, a gateway from our reality into the Ascendant Plane. We held the bridge, opened the way, and stepped through. On the other side, we were greeted by darkness and a sky of green fire. We had taken our first steps into the Ascendant Realm, and we now stood within Crota's own sword world, the Oversoul Throne. It was crucial that we killed Crota here and nowhere else, for to truly kill an Ascendant hive, you must kill them within their throne realm. Any other death would not be true, and would simply leave them regenerating here in time. No, here we had to slay him, and in this place we needed to use the logic of the sword in order to slaughter him. We proved our competence not only by crossing one side of his Ascendant realm via the use of a bridge, most literally demonstrating our use of the sword logic, but also by slaying Yut, the Death Singer. We then summoned the Hive Champion to combat, and faced our very first god. It is crucial here to remember something Toland once said on the nature of Hive swords. He said that any other weapon of the Hive, such as a boomer or a shredder, only kills acyclically, that they send out harm and take nothing back. When the boomer's fire is all but gone, it is nothing, and when the shredder's ammunition has been discharged, it is no more than axion and neutrino scatter. But the sword goes on. The sword is like a bridge. It binds wielder to victim. It binds life to death. And when the binding is done, the sword remembers, and will be hungrier and sharper for it. This is the logic that rules the hive, the logic of the sword, where the ultimate shape of the universe would be one made sharp over eons of slaughter. It was once Toland's sage advice to Eris that should they seek power in their quest at any point to conquer the hive in their own throne world, it would be best to remember that the ultimate arbiter in the realms of the hive would be that of a sword made sharp with the blood of the conquered, blood that had been spilled over millennia. And so, we used these weapons. We slew Crota's sword-bearers in their own realm and claimed their blades, giving us access to a weapon that could destroy a god. And so, with our light, we stunned the god prince, and with the weapons of the hive, with his own sword, we sundered him from existence. At long last, Eris's fire team would know some form of peace, and Waining's death, as well as Oriana's, had been avenged. But woe to those that believed our struggle to be over, for at the moment of his death, Crota cried out across the night, and soon the night would answer. Whilst Earth was still reeling from the Hive invasion, the death of the Hive Prince Crota would not go unnoticed by the other occupants of Sol. And so it happened that the Queen of the Reef would have use of such a talented guardian. The disgraced former Kell of the House of Wolves, Skolas the Rabid, was released by the Nine, for reasons unknown. The Nine are a strange and shadowy organization, found to be dark matter made manifest, but their intentions have always been alien to us. It is unclear why Skolas was released by them, but perhaps in time we will discover. They also gifted him with a catch, allowing him to effectively begin to reassemble his old house. Marvel's usurpation of the fallen wolves had always been an interesting question of loyalty for those that swore allegiance to her, and the fallen that had joined her had now betrayed her, rejoining their old Kell Skolas. The wolves would make an unsuccessful attempt on Mara's life, which in spite of failing, did cost the lives of many Awoken corsairs. At this, Mara would know no boundary to vengeance, and her fury would be legendary. She opened the reef to the Guardian, and petitioned them to hunt down the treacherous fallen wolves, and their terrible Kell, Skolas. Our search began with the assistance of Petra Venge, the Queen's Wrath. She would send us to the remains of the House of Winter's stronghold on Venus, where Skolas was proclaiming himself to be the Kell of Kells. According to tales, the Kell of Kells would unite all of the houses, all catchers would be bent to him, and at last he would be acknowledged by the great machine, the Traveller itself. We quickly tore into him and his forces, and whilst he was able to both escape and pull the House of Winter into his fold, we were able to follow him to his next target, the House of Devils. Here, instead of direct usurpation, Skolas attempted a subtler tactic. He used the assassins of the Silent Fang to try and eliminate the leadership of the house. This would have left a power vacuum which Skolas could have stepped into, and thus used it to gain control of the house. However, the devils were prepared for him, and we found our way into the Cosmodrome and traced back the Silent Fang, eventually destroying them, and giving Skolas no claim over the House of Devils. With this, Skolas pursued yet another house, and went after the House of Kings, attempting to forge a diplomatic alliance between the two, so that he could keep his Kellship afloat. We interrupted this meeting between the kings and the wolves' barons, and slew them all where they stood, ending Skolas' hope of attaining the support of any other houses in the system. With no further fallen to support his claim, Skolas changed tactics, and this time attempted to claim weaponry that would afford him a significant advantage. It is here that he turned to the technology of the Vex, and to the infamous Vault of Glass. Amongst its confines, Skolas would find copious amounts of Vex technology, thanks to the weakened architecture of this place now that we had raided it. The mighty fortress was still able, however, to commit and create oracles for the situation, and Skolas was attempting to capture and use them, with some degree of success as well, it is worth adding. However, we destroyed these oracles and denied Skolas the chance to use their power. With almost no more options, Skolas ascended to the top of the Vex Citadel, a mighty and gravity-defying structure on Venus. There, he would hold his ground for a final stand. We pursued him, and even though he was able to use the Vex technology to pull the House of Wolves soldiers through time to his location, Skolas was unable to hold us back. A simple Kell is nothing to a guardian prepared, and Skolas fell before us, laid low and left vulnerable for capture by the agents of the reef. After being rewarded by Mara Sov, and told of the thanks that the reef would sing, we had the respect of a monarch, and a powerful ally was forged with the city. We would go on to defeat Skolas in one final combat. He languished yet again in the prison of elders, but his trial would be won in the ways of old, a trial by combat, and therefore we would be his judge, jury and executioners, and in this trial by combat there would be no mercy, and we would destroy the former Kell of the House of Wolves once and for all. But this was not the enduring legacy of Solus. Instead, it was his final conversation with Mara that would be of concern. His last words would be of a dark binder and a light snuffer. They left him whimpering in fear. But with his fear, Mara would know well enough who he was speaking of. Her, Eris, and Osiris would all meet in secret to plan for what was to come next. Skolas's words were but another confirmation of what Mara already knew. A terrible shadow loomed on the horizon, and they needed to prepare for it. A plan was devised to defeat the coming threat, but it would come at great cost. For now, another monarch was approaching, and he desired one thing: vengeance. Behold the wrath of Oryx, bound in fury for the death of his son. The taken king was making his way to our system, and in time he would make his mark upon our world in a manner that would be irrevocable. He would arrive in the system at Saturn's rings, and would immediately be met by Queen Mara's sword and a massive Awoken fleet. Though the power of their vessels allowed them to contend with the Hive, it was the Queen's own devastating use of a weapon known as the Harbingers that would destroy Oryx's forces. But when Mara had gotten back to her feet, having exhausted herself in order to clear the way, one vessel still stood: Oryx's Dreadnought. Upon the ship, the taken king used the primary weapon of the vessel, allowing the throne world to fall outwards into real space, consuming and destroying all before him. Prince Aldrin was able to escape the terrible wave of Paracolvalages, but Mara was left consumed by the wave, along with the Tessans Kali, Sabia, and Shurochi. But Mara had accomplished her part of the plan. It was now up to Eris and the army of guardians that she had motivated to kill Oryx's son. The system of Sol would never be the same. With these events, the Taken War had begun. We only discovered Oryx's arrival in the system when we traveled to a Cabal base in Phobos, which was under attack by a strange new kind of enemy. As sterile neutrino scatter filled the atmosphere, and a shadowy presence moved its eyes to this part of the system, Eris's voice grew fearful, and then terrified. Finally, she cried out in horror at the realization that the father of her nemesis, the patriarch of the Altnian dynasty, was here. Oryx had come. He unleashed his armies of Taken across the system, populating our worlds with the dark and sickly forms of the foes we had once known that were now corrupted by darkness. The Taken had invaded. We quickly fled the moon of Phobos for our lives, and returned to the tower to meet with the Vanguard. Whilst Ikora and Zavala waited, it was Cade who would put the plan into action. He would task us with retrieving a stealth drive from the top of our colony ship in the Cosmodrome. This stealth drive and Eris's ship that she had recovered from the Hellmouth would allow us to infiltrate the Dreadnought, although the stealth drive's malfunction led to the destruction of Eris's ship, as Oryx used his super weapon once again. Once aboard the Dreadnought, we disabled the weapon that had been attacking the Awoken fleet, and established a beachhead from which guardians could assault Oryx's ship. We were, however, not alone on the vessel. A group of Cabal from the Skyborners Legion, led by their Primus himself, was in the process of invading the ship. But when faced with the power of Oryx, he was but a minor nuisance. Oryx took the Primus right before our eyes. But this was of little concern to us. For the Cabal, though, it would be a devastating blow, and the Skybound's legion would be left restless in the command of its two Bond brothers' Alice's. We, however, would push further into the ship in search of Oryx, and found our way blocked by a portal that could only be accessed by an ascendant hive. So, in order to gain ingress, we would have to be where our enemy was. We would have to become, or at least pass through, an ascendant hive. He first returned to the moon and collected a portion of the crystal that once held Crota's soul, as he was being summoned back into the mortal realm. Following this, as well as the acquisition of personal stealth code from warmind bunkers below Earth, we snuck back into Crota's own throne world, the Oversoul Throne. The Hive were holding a death ceremony for Crota there. We snuck in and used the crystal we had gathered earlier to extract the essence of Crota's soul. The Hive detected us, and the Token were unleashed to fight us. But thanks to Eris and a few tricks she had learned from Toland, we were able to escape. With the essence of Crota's soul now in tow, we returned to the Dreadnought, and were recognized by the portal of Ascendant. We journeyed deep into the heart of the Dreadnought, and found Oryx at the center of his defenses. At his altar, we found the God King of the Hive, and in spite of all his eons of war and all the power at his fingertips, we prevailed. We struck down the God King and broke his resolve upon the anvil of our light. Oryx was forced to make a choice. Needing to retreat, he summoned forth his power and took himself, allowing himself to escape so that he might live to fight another day. But regardless of the fact that he had escaped, Oryx's corporeal form had been shattered, and the God King's blade, Willbreaker, lay broken. From the remains of the sword, Eris took a shard and gifted it to us, allowing us to forge the first swords wielded by Guardians in generations, with a little assistance from Lord Shax. We had to set the darkness within our new blades into balance, and to empower them with light. By killing the sword of Oryx, Ektar, we were able to accomplish this. With our new blades in hand, we started taking apart Oryx's taken forces within the system, killing his shades and his echoes throughout the worlds that were previously ours. He could not claim any more power when we had removed his stakes in these worlds, destroying those echoes. And with those echoes destroyed, we would descend upon his court, weakening those that fed him power through the tile system that the Hive ruled by. With all of his tribute weakened, finally, we set out once more to kill a god. And so yet again, 6 of us went down into the depths of the Dreadnought, accessing Oryx's throne world through his court, and defeating his war priest, the beast Golgoroth, and his 2 daughters, Oranuk and Urhalak, before finally facing the Taken King himself. Oryx would make terrible doxologies to the darkness and would unleash the full nature of his power against us, as the sword logic dictated he must. But we were able to unleash a power of our own. By defeating the light-eater ogres that had consumed great amounts of light, we were able to take this and set it free, detonating each orb of light like a bomb. This left Oryx decimated, and finally, after so many detonations had been struck, we broke the Taken King, and unlike his son, we broke him not merely with the powers of darkness, but instead with the power of the light. Sword logic had triumphed previously, but now we had shown the strength of the light. The inner complexities of the universe could be used instead of the simplicity and the edge of a blade. This was not sword logic, this was bomb logic. We slew Oryx utterly, and at long last, the lord and ruler of the Ultian dynasty, the scourge of 1,000 worlds, and the bane of trillions upon trillions of souls, was vanquished. But the legacy of this era would not soon be forgotten. Not only did we have to deal with potential contenders to the throne, such as Malok and the Darkblade Arakul, but we also found his calcified fragments, and stored within them we found the records of the Books of Sorrow. With these pieces, and with their plans in mind, Eris took the remnants of Oryx's war priest, his daughters, and the ravenous heart of Oryx himself, combining them into the weapon that the books of Pharaoh spoke of. She paused for but a moment as she considered whether to create it or not, but her overwhelming desire to see her every hatred imaginable placed upon the hive drove her onwards. And when we who aided her in its construction had seen it completed, she gifted it to us. This would be the touch of malice, and it would repay every torment that the hive had dealt, but this time in the hands of a light-bearer. This would be the last remnant of Oryx, the means by which the God King would live on, and by which he would be empowered. But there was also one more threat that we had to deal with. The Cabal had sent a distress signal out from their vessel, the Vanguard 6. They had crashed it into the Dreadnought so that they might create a beachhead, but now they had retreated there, being pushed back by the remnants of the hive and taken forces that still swarmed the Dreadnought. Upon clearing them from the Vanguard 6's command center, we saw that a message had been transmitted by the Cabal forces of the Skygunners, and upon closer inspection, the headers of the message indicated that it was for the head of the Cabal Empire. In time, we would see this menace rise, but it would be at least another 2 years before we were faced with the terrible realization of who this would be. For now, we sat and waited, secure in the knowledge of our supremacy, until the next crisis loomed on the horizon. It was a mostly quiet year after we had defeated Oryx, the Taken King. The Taken War had left much of the system ravaged, from the reef to Earth, to Mars, to Venus. But at long last, something new began to stir. Near the end of the summer, a strange grouping of nanites appeared within the Guardian population. They offered incredible benefits to the Guardians, but they also represented the risk of a major pandemic. And so, an organization known as the Owl Sector was activated in response to this sudden occurrence. The event, which would henceforth be known as the Transmission Crisis, was merely a precursor to what would come next. The nanites had originated from the Clovis Bray laboratory on Mars, where exploring Fallen from the House of Devils had broken in and had discovered the location of a valuable technology, Fever. With this, the Fallen House of Devils were on the hunt, and returned renewed to a long-forgotten area of the Cosmodrome. They headed into its northeasternmost sector, and rediscovered the Plague Lands. And with that, an old wolf was roused from its vigil. Lord Saladin rose to face the House of Devils, and rallied the Guardians to retake Belwinter Peak, which had been long silent since the Iron Lord's defeat at the hands of Fever. As we moved to retake the mountaintop fortress at Bostock Observatory, we were greeted by the proof of the new power in the House of Devils. The house had been taken over by its splicers, the bioengineers and body hackers that every house holds a host of. They had resurrected an all-too-familiar foe, Cephix Prime, but Cephix was different. Part of its shell was missing, and other parts held a new kind of metallic material that was clearly not of the Fallen's own making. We defeated this hulking monstrosity and sent the devils into a full retreat. When we regrouped with Lord Saladin, he told us of this once great fortress and gave us the honor of reigniting the ceremonial braziers within the Iron Temple, signaling the return of the Iron Lord. We were sent deeper into the Plague Lands to investigate the new source of power and the strange resurrection of Cephix Prime. It was here that we discovered that the Fallen had taken Fever and used it to augment themselves. For a Fallen, this would not only provide the practical advantages of making them stronger in combat, but with the Fallen's faith and their reverence towards machines, they believed that they were being elevated into demigods. Demigod or not, these cyborg fallen were of course still just fallen, and in spite of their upgrades, they were no match for us. We then pushed deeper into the playground and discovered that the fallen had used SbMy to recreate and re-empower artillery emplacements within the playground, posing an imminent threat to the city and the Guardians operating in the area. We stormed their position with all haste so that we might not give them a chance to cause any damage. Our time was limited, and so we were alone, but eventually we were victorious. It was then that Lord Saladin invited us back to the Iron Temple so that he could explain the history and story of the Iron Lords to us, as well as the story of how they had died to SbMy. With this, we were sent to investigate the source of SbMy itself, so following the word of the cryptarch Tyra Khan, we went out to the Dust Palace on Mars, where we would find the original labs which the Fallen had broken into. Armed with more knowledge on SbMy, and having established that the Fallen had not fully mastered it, we set out into the playgrounds to destroy the source of the nanites, the replication complex where the Iron Lords had fought and died all those years ago, above which there was now a great fallen fortress. It turned out that Yolda's original explosion had not destroyed the SbMy replicator, it had merely damaged it and left it dormant, with the Fallen now exposing it. Nanites were flooding the entirety of the playgrounds once again, snaking back and forth, in vines twisting but giant, 10 feet across at times. SbMy was on the move, and we had to stop it. But we also needed to get through the Fallen's defenses, and so we sabotaged them, not only destroying them but also destabilizing all of the SbMy in the area, significantly cutting it back. From there we pushed into the Archon's fortress, and found that as we headed down, the replication chamber was in reach. But when we entered the SbMy replicator, we found something far more gruesome than merely the Fallen. We found that SbMy had taken the bodies and weapons of the Iron Lords, and had not killed them, but had twisted them and broken them, transforming their bodies and weapons into horrifying mockeries of what they once were. These were SbMy Iron Lords, light weaponized against our light, and with that, we had no choice left but to free them, and to kill the reanimated remains of these Iron Lords. Winter, Galeon, and Yolda met their final rest that day. With the battle won, we set the SbMy replication complex to blow, and fled with our lives as fast as we could. Upon returning to the Iron Temple, and giving Saladin Yolda's old helmet, he knew that at long last his friends had been laid to rest. And with this he presented us with a new sword, the Young Howl, declaring us to be the first in a new generation of Iron Lords. But there was one final trial that remained. Shiro 4, the Vanguard scout assigned to the Iron Temple, intercepted a Fallen transmission coming from deep within the Plaguelands. What he had intercepted was a message from the new leader of the House of Devils, who was beckoning all the Fallen in the system to come to the Plaguelands, to a place that he was referring to as the Perfection Complex. He invited them to be reborn as demigods with SbMy in hand. And this could mean only one thing. If the Fallen successfully gathered an army to their cause, they would be able to push out and attack the city, although this time they would be empowered by the power of the SbMy, and they would not be fighting for the sake of reclaiming the great machine. Instead, they would strike out in the belief that they were gods, and that they were owed the right to purge those that had wronged them, at 6 fronts, at Twilight Gap, at every opportunity. Yet again, we were forced to assemble a team, and with the 6 of us united in our cause, we struck out into the Plaguelands to shatter the Devil's Splicers and their command structure. In the process of this preemptive strike, we defeated the second in command of the Splicers, known as Vosik, the Archpriest, and we dismantled the terrifying siege engine atop a section of the Cosmodrome wall, which we sent plummeting into the sea. All of this before descending into the heart of the Perfection Complex itself, where the light ended and evolution began. It was here that we awakened and challenged Axis, the Archon Prime. The Fallen was no mere demigod according to them. It had been completely converted from biological being into mechanical beast. To the Fallen, Axis was a god, not a demigod, not a pretender to some prophecy, but a true, fully-fledged god. And with this, we needed to fight and destroy this machine now. For surely a god able to rally those to the banner cry of "I have defeated the Guardians, and I will now take their city," was all the more dangerous. And so we thought. But something that was quick to be realized by Axis was that evolution would not be enough. That's the thing about light. It shines where you least expect it, and even at the darkness where it ends, it can break through. Having broken the splices and left them leaderless, a new age dawned upon the city. We were triumphant, and the city was secure. And thus began what is known as the Age of Triumph. We took to celebrate our great victory over the many powers that had risen against us. The whole of the city embraced what would be a new era of short peace. The children who were once frightened by the stories no longer being told and the dark forces that were encroaching upon the system were no longer frightened at all. But the signs that this age was short-lived were already present. Eris Morn would abandon the tower, heading out into the deep black to face the enemies of humanity once again. And in addition, the Fallen broke ranks, abandoning their old allegiances and leaving their armory and heraldry to burn. At first, humanity saw the retreat as a joyous sign of victory. The 100-year siege in which the city had endured at the hands of the Fallen had finally come to an end. But alas, with the siege broken, a far greater power was waiting in the wings, a power that would strike hard and fast at our ranks and would pose the greatest challenge to us that we had ever suffered. The Age of Triumph would be closed dramatically under a red shadow led by a dominating commander, and his name would be Gaul. The Age of Triumph that had brought us into a brief moment of peace was shattered irrevocably by Dominus Gaul and his Red Legion, who attacked the city in force with their entire fleet. Gaul had originally risen to power by usurping the power of the previous Cabal Emperor, and with his mentor, the Consul, always at his side, the new leader of this entire civilization that brought the full might of the Cabal war machine to Earth. He arrived and broke through the city's defenses, approaching the traveler with what can best be described as a cage. The guardians of the city, of course, responded, and as we returned from our patrol on the edges of the outer system, we were thrust directly into the conflict. It was up to us to infiltrate Dominus Gaul's flagship, the Immortal, and to disable it so we could launch a conclusive assault upon the vessel. But as we headed to the upper decks so that we could be extracted, we came face to face with the Dominus himself, and he showed us the truest extent of his powers. The cage around the traveler activated, sapping our abilities and stripping our light from us. Once more, we were mortal, and our ghost was left crippled. We were defenseless. As Dominus Gaul proclaimed victory over the city and decreed that we were unworthy of the traveler's light, he kicked us from the deck of his ship and let us fall to earth. Thus, with the single defeat ever served the city, the Red War had begun. Darkness consumed our vision, and we received a dream from the traveler. We dreamt of the darkness attacking and destroying our citizens, of the travelers feeding of our worlds, of the Cabal and their fleet, and a strange ship that we would come to know all too soon, and of long-lost techniques of light, with a staff, a sword, and a shield. Finally, the vision would show us a place on Earth. It would show us a shard of some kind that had fallen to Earth. This, as it turns out, was the shard of the traveler in the European Dead Zone, and it was calling to us. This was our destination. But first, we needed to leave. We made our escape from the city through the sewer pipes and underground systems, out through the wall. For an entire 8 weeks, we trekked through rough terrain and Cabal-infested territory, until at last, we fell. exhausted in a glade. We awoke to see a friendly human face. Her name was Soraya Hawthorne, and she was evacuating soldiers and refugees to a place only referred to as the farm. Upon arriving, we could see the shard of the traveller across the bay, and so we set out on a desperate quest to find out why the traveller had called us to this place. In sight of the fallen occupying the area and the new mortal threat that they posed to us, we pressed on, until at last we came to the base of the shard. Our ghost, left quivering and broken since the activation of the cage, was suddenly empowered, and with their revitalization, a beam of power surged through them and into us. Our mortal bonds were broken, and our light returned to us. With the brilliant new powers at our disposal, we returned to the farm, and began the inevitable duty once more of being a guardian. Before we could fight back though, we would need to be able to communicate with the rest of the system once more. After helping to establish this communications network, we picked up an emergency transmission from Commander Zavala, who had escaped and had ordered all the Guardians that still lived to regroup at Saturn's moon of Titan to prepare for a counterattack. In spite of Soraya's insistence that we should stay, we had a clear course. If the light still lived in us, we had to coordinate with the greater Guardian forces. The city was still at stake, and so we took our jump ship and headed to Titan to regroup with the other Guardians. When we arrived, the Guardians were in chaos, having uncovered an entire colony of hive on the old rigs of the New Pacific Arcology, where they had tried to create a staging area. Our first task was therefore to secure the Arcology's maintenance rigs, and to restore power to them so the base of operations could function. After having successfully done this, we were informed by Deputy Commander Sloan of a series of intercepted Red Legion communications that they needed help decrypting. In order to speed this process, we went into the depths of the Arcology and stole one of its CPUs, engaging in a daring escape in an old vehicle that led us through the entire length of the Central Hive colony. With the messages decrypted, we learned of the true extent of the dire situation in which we now found ourselves. The Red Legion had not only taken the city, but had also maneuvered a massive weapon engagement into orbit around our sun. This weapon platform was known as the Almighty, and if given the right commands, the Almighty could be used to detonate the sun, destroying our entire system. Our plans were now complicated by this new weapon and its destructive power. But knowing that our light had returned, Commander Zavala refused to give up, and relocated the surviving Guardian forces to the farm. Following this, we tracked Cave-6 to a far-flung planetoid called Nessus. This place had been completely consumed by the Vex and their infestation, and it was discovered here that Cade had traveled to the place in an attempt to retrieve a Vex teleportation device. This would give him a means of getting close enough to assassinate Dominus Gaul if he was successful. However, not quite understanding the security systems of the teleporter or the Vex, Cade was trapped inside an infinite loop that teleported him all over Nessus, and was unable to escape. In the end, we freed Cade with the help of a new Golden Age friend, an AI from a Golden Age vessel that had crashed on Nessus long ago. Her name was Failsafe, and she had somewhat of a split personality, having been degraded over time and damaged. The Golden Age ship that she had crashed with was the Exodus Black, and Cade was then teleported there. He held up against a fallen assault, but eventually we freed him, and reunited with our old friend. Cade learned that the only one that needed to reunite with the Oldfire team was Ikora, and immediately directed us to Io, which was not only where we found her, but it was also a particularly holy site for warlocks, as it was the last place that the traveller touched before heading to Earth during the events of the collapse. Io, as a result, was filled with the energy of the traveller's light, and this had drawn the Cabal to it, who had begun to set up bases with the intent of mining that energy, although they were unsuccessful. Whilst both you and Ikora saw that this was clearly not going to work, they now understood the clear intentions of the Cabal. They were attempting to utilize the light. Gaul's reasons for imprisoning the traveller were made all the clearer now. given that the Traveler was the light's source. He wished to be chosen as a guardian, and he wished to be the Traveler's worthy warrior, leading at the head of an entire army of chosen Cabal, ones that would use the light as a weapon of conquest, given to them by their right of might. After discovering this, we were forced to repel a taken invasion on Io. They were drawn by the Traveler's energy, and in the process of doing this, we met a rather peculiar warlock known as Ashamir, an old friend of Eris Moon's. Following this, we needed to further analyze the Almighty, and knowing that there was a dormant warmind bunker in the system that might scan the Almighty for weaknesses, we endeavored to embark on another journey. We entered the bunker and used its systems to scan the Almighty. After doing this, we unfortunately discovered that the Almighty was irrevocably tethered to our sun. Destroying the Almighty would also create a chain reaction that would destroy our sun, and so the safest option would instead be to disable the weapon. From here we returned to Earth and undertook a plan to defeat the Cabal. The commander of the European Dead Zone's Cabal force, Timos the Unbroken, was holed up in his ship, the Urabas Ventura. Killing him was something that would aid the resistance effort, but he was a linchpin to the plan. Killing him would give us access to his personal shuttle code, a shuttle that would be registered with the Cabal IFF system. This meant that we'd be able to board the shuttle, get close to the Almighty, and then enter it to shut it down. At the same time, the city would be attacked by the joint forces of the Guardians, who would make a final desperate bid to place the Vex teleporter as close to Gaul's command ship as possible. Following this, we would return from the Almighty, and then hopefully find the city's forces that had besieged the Cabal within the city itself, use the teleporter, and then defeat Dominus Gaul. All the while that this was happening, Gaul had been talking with the Speaker, who he had captured during the initial assault on the city. They spoke constantly, trading jabs and insults and occasionally trading knowledge. All of this continued up until the point that there was an attack on the Almighty, and the Speaker made a stunning confession to Gaul that contrary to popular belief that he himself had helped to propagate, the Traveler did not speak to him, and that during his entire time guiding the city as its patriarch, he had allowed everyone around him to perpetuate this ignorant, foolish belief. This, along with the constant irritation that the consul had always offered, left Gaul enraged. He killed the consul and left the Speaker to die, and endeavored to force the Traveler's light upon himself. He would not be chosen. He would do as the Cabal did. He would take the light. When we finally disabled the Almighty, and our plan started to fall into action, we returned and arrived to the city. Our shuttle was shot down not far from where Zavala, Ikora, and Cade were, but the Vanguard fire team was wounded on a rooftop, and we had to head through the Vex teleporter and stop Gaul alone. We were the only ones with the light, and we were the only ones that could stop him from taking over the system and drain the Traveler's power. We boarded the Almighty and faced Gaul on the topside deck of his flagship, where we discovered that he had grossly empowered himself with the light and had gained the ability to use some of our own powers. Now, with terrible menace in combat, Gaul pursued us and battled us across the deck of his ship. But the light that the Cabal had stored was not enough power for Gaul to defeat us, and so, eventually, we fought him back. Continually, he re-empowered himself with the power of the light. Every time, it would burn him back, dealing more damage to him, until eventually, our light proved stronger. Gaul fell, and we proved once and for all that Guardians were chosen. But this death was not the last thing we would see of him. Gaul was able to temporarily manifest as some kind of massive avatar of himself. In his more titanic form, he believed himself to be a god. He believed himself victorious, and he told the city below to witness the dawning of a new age. And it would be the dawning of a new age, but Gaul would not be a part of it. So he had forgotten about the greatest of humanity's saviors, the one that would ultimately deliver us through the time of darkness. He had forgotten about the Traveler. It was at this moment that the bonds of the cage broke, Being unable to contain the new power waiting within, the traveller arose once more, and Gaul was burnt away by its light before the cage and the outer shell utterly shattered. The traveller was free. The traveller had truly returned to life, and with that, the Guardians had all seen their powers return, and a wave of light spread out across the universe from its return. It washed over the Calorus spires on Mercury, to Hellas Basin on Mars, to the tangled shore of the reef, and even to the darkest reaches of the Dreadnought, still hanging in orbit around Saturn. It reached out further and further into the universe, illuminating our whole galaxy. But when it finally reached the dark space beyond, it was stopped. The light's return had awakened its equal. Just as the warlock Ulan Khan dictated, where there is light, by the nature of the universe's symmetry, you must also have shadow. And so it was that the ancient enemy of the traveller, the darkness, was also awakened once more. Before we could fully feel the repercussions of the traveller's return, we had one final mystery to attend to. In the new tower, an invitation was left for us. It congratulated us on our murder of Dominus Gaul. It was from a certain Emperor Callus, and he had invited us to join him at his Leviathan, to test ourselves, and to, as he would put it, grow fat from strength. We boarded this massive vessel, which it turned out we had seen in our vision from the traveller. The vessel had begun to consume and orbit the planetoid of Nessus, using it for fuel and sustenance, and it was clear that Callus at this point was a Cabal, the Cabal being the only ones capable of not only hosting a series of Cabal soldiers, but also of designing a machine that could consume an entire planet. Beyond all of this, it was clear that Callus was indeed the former emperor of the Cabal, the one that Dominus Gaul had deposed. Callus then put us through a series of 3 tests in order to determine our worth as warriors, before we found ourselves standing before him in his ornate throne room. What ensued was a battle against the former emperor. But as time went on, and the emperor was damaged by our weapons fire, it suddenly became clear that we were not fighting the real Emperor Callus, but merely a robotic automata that was imitating him. Upon defeating the machine, we heard it speak of how it had seen a power greater than our right, and that we should heed its word, take these rewards, and grow fat from strength. We were then handsomely rewarded, and it was made clear that we would not seen the last of this mysterious Emperor Callus, or these crazed automata that he would speak through. The events of the traveller's reawakening would be felt far and wide across the systems, and would start what is known as the Second Golden Age for humanity. However, the first new adventure awaiting us on the horizon would stir the return of legends and myth, and would start in the blazing sands of Mercury. Osiris had returned. With the pulse of light emanating from the traveller, the whole system awakened with activity, not the least of which came from the Vex on Mercury. Not only were there reports of a massive Vex gateway activating suddenly in the middle of the Calorus sands, there was also a finding made by hidden scouts positioned on Mercury. In the sands just outside the gate, they had found the ghost of a rather strange guardian, one that was infamous to the city, and one who now appeared to be in trouble. This was Sagira, the ghost of the rather infamous warlock Osiris. Sagira had been damaged in an attack on the pair within the vast simulation engine of the Infinite Forest, which lay below Mercury's surface. Just before the pair had been attacked, Osiris had comprehended that the Vex mind Panoptes, which was responsible for the Infinite Forest, was also capable of now simulating a future in which the Vex achieved their ultimate victory. This would be their goal of creating a universe without light or dark, where the Vex were the beginning and the end, where they were able to calculate their victory entirely, and where none would be able to stop them. Previously, we had stopped the dangerous methods of time control used by the Vex in places such as the Vault of Glass, but with a simulation that would allow them to chart their path to a perfect future, the Vex would be able to become the ultimate arbiters of the universe, and they would ensure that neither light nor dark would exist. All this would be explained to us in time, but first we had to investigate the gateway into the forest and gain ingress. When we were not able to access it, the Vex in the area responded in force, supplying Vex from the future timelines. This was a sign of the danger present, as the Vex would only draw upon such forces if they were truly threatened. After defeating them, we rendezvoused with Brother Vance in the old lighthouse of the Colorist Spires. Brother Vance was a disciple of the Osirian cult, one that followed Osiris from the city with a certain level of obsession. It was not backed by Osiris, who had always found them to be irritating to say the least, but they had made every effort to study his teachings and to learn from his so-called prophecies. Vance suggested taking Sagira's damaged shell to one of the Osirian cult's bases within the European Dead Zone. This base had unfortunately been overrun with Fallen, but regardless, whilst there we were able to revive Sagira, who temporarily took over our ghost's shell so that she could coordinate with us. She then led us into the Infinite Forest, where we found Osiris's reflections. The Warlock had used the technology of the Vex to copy himself and to duplicate throughout the forest so that he could cover more ground. One of these reflections would then explain the nature of the threat that Panoptes posed to us by showing us the simulated future that awaited us if we failed to stop the Vex. In order to prevent this dark future, the solution was simple. We had to kill Panoptes and wrest the Vex's control of the forest. In order to do this, we needed to retrieve a map of the Infinite Forest so that we might be able to find Panoptes, and after doing this, it was determined that we needed more data to find the Vex mines. Ikora and Sagira discovered that along with the map, the best way to find Panoptes would be to trace the Vex simulation back to the point at which it was simulated to have an origin in its timeline. This was when Panoptes had been created, within the simulated path that could be found within the forest. We could then use this information to track the trajectory that Panoptes had forged, and ultimately we could use this along with the map to find him in the present. Complex as all this might sound, this allowed us to gain a set of coordinates to Panoptes' location, although Sagira was captured in the process. After being ejected from the Infinite Forest, Ikora Ray met us at Mercury, and forced the gateway open for us again so that we could head to those coordinates where Panoptes would end up. There, we battled with the Vex mind, and with the aid of the Warlock Osiris and his reflections, we defeated it utterly. After defeating the Vex mind, Osiris took his first steps outside the forest since he had entered it upon his exile, and exchanged a few kind words with his student, Ikora Ray, before returning to guard over the forest and to keep the Vex in check, once and for all. However, our adventures with the Vex did not end here. One day, our team ventured back into the Leviathan and found our way through its engine room. After being assaulted by Cabal forces for our intrusion, Callus himself called the attack off and stated that perhaps we could help the Cabal with an engine problem that they had developed. Upon further inspection, as we were blasted into the smelting core of the Leviathan, it was seen that it had swallowed the entirety of the planet core mind of Nessus, a massive Vex that would be known as Argos. Argos had activated a defensive shield that had stopped all momentum within the Leviathan's furnaces, immobilizing it and preventing it from going any further or performing some of its standard functions. However, through teamwork and with the application of the plentiful firepower that we had gathered, we were able to destroy the Vex core mind, and we were saved from annihilation by Callus, and once again, for our efforts we were handsomely rewarded. but old powers were stirring and returning to life once more, and they would be the next ones to shake the system. The Traveler's light had not only acted as a disturbing presence to the Rex, but it had also stirred ancient forces that lay buried on Mars within the region known as Hellas Basin. We intercepted a distress signal coming from the area, which turned out to be none other than the notorious gunslinger Anna Bray. It turned out that Anna had not in fact fallen at the Battle of the Twilight Gap, but had instead deliberately faked her own death so that she could pursue her heritage and more knowledge on the war-mind Rasputin. The Vanguard had always hounded her for the pursuit of this knowledge, and now she could pursue it in peace. Her search had taken her here, to Mars, where thanks to the Traveler's returning light, the ice around Rasputin, which had been used in the collapse to imprison Zol and Nokris, was beginning to thaw. Now the Warmind was left surrounded by an army of frozen hives, led by an exiled hive prince, and by Zol, the will of thousands. After reclaiming the great facilities and having a run-in with Zavala, Anna and the commander immediately fell into conflict over the course of action that should be taken against Zol and Nokris. Anna believed that the Warmind Rasputin, if correctly directed and encouraged, could work as their ally, whereas Zavala saw it as dangerous and as a tool that needed to be brought under control and contained, and then never used. Regardless, the hive would need to be drawn out in order to be defeated, and in order to do this, we decided to head to the European Dead Zone and collect a small shard of the Traveler to act as bait to lure them out. In this encounter, Anna Bray demonstrated a remarkable ability to coordinate Rasputin and to get him to break down the taken shielding that was locking the shard of the Traveler in place. With this, we headed deep into the hive lair that held Nokris, and we defeated the Herald of Zol, planting the bait for the greater threat of the Worm God itself. When finally we confronted the Worm God, we were utterly powerless, and its darkness was so intense that it was capable of immobilizing us and leaving us for dead under a collapsing snowbank. Fully awakened, Zol would now make a desperate push for the Warmind and its critical systems in a bid to take it out once and for all. But throughout our tenure on Mars, Rasputin had been supplying us with a weapon of its own design, a relic known as the Valkyrie, a spear bristling with the energy of the Warmind itself that was capable of intense damage when thrown. Now, it was time to forge a new Valkyrie, of even greater might, one that could be used to defeat Zol. We systematically overloaded Rasputin's core in order for its power to swell, and we then converted its overwhelming energy into the new Valkyrie, supercharging it and giving us the perfect weapon with which to defeat Zol. The titanic Worm God roared above us, and rose in size to a height so great that it utterly dwarfed us. But with the aid of the javelin, we were able to bring this beast down, as well as all of its hive servants. With the Valkyrie in hand, we went about slaying this Worm God. And finally, it fell. As Rasputin was saved, we gathered with Zavala and Anna Bray in Rasputin's control center, and the Warmind spoke to us for the first time in centuries, declaring itself to be the greatest defender of humanity. Whilst previously it had shrugged off its duties of defense during the collapse, it had returned and has begun to launch an entirely new warsat network into the system to assist humanity. No longer would it be the broken fragments of itself that we had found on Earth. Now Rasputin had truly returned, and with the new warsat network in orbit, all of his systems would come back online. The Warmind was back in play, and with it, we had gained a powerful ally. But beyond just this, Rasputin asserted its independence from the Vanguard, and stated that it could aid humanity in their survival by its own self-determination, and that it had to be respected by groups such as the Vanguard, which simply used it as a tool wherever they saw it necessary. Whilst this left Zavala uneasy, Anna Gray was able to stay behind as a liaison and as the voice of the war mind, and would work with Guardian interests at heart. Rasputin would be its great defender once again, and would not be something corrupted by the system as our needs desired. Rasputin would smite the threats that he saw coming, and would aid us in many different endeavors in the time to come. It was then that we received yet another message from Emperor Callus, who invited us back to the Leviathan to deal with yet another problem. This time Callus's ship was being invaded by Val-Kaur, the last commanding officer of the Red Legion. Kaur had planned to commandeer the Leviathan and to use it as a command and control vessel from which the remaining Red Legion loyalists could change the tide of what was to them still the Red War. Even though they had been utterly defeated, they held on to a steady hope that they might still attain victory if they could only wrest control of the Leviathan from Callus. But with our intervention, we not only decimated Kaur himself, but also used the Leviathan's weaponry to utterly destroy the remains of the Red Legion fleet. With this, a small time of peace came upon the Guardians, and we remembered those that we had lost in the Red War, all too unaware that soon we were about to lose even more. Of the story so far began with a voice inside the mind of the Prince of the Reef, Prince Aldrin. He believed this voice to be Mara, his sister, who he had been searching for since the start of the Taken War. But the voice was in fact the voice of Riven, and it would slowly drive him to madness. But why was Riven communing with him, and what could she possibly want? The explanation is better understood if we step back to the unseen events of the Taken War. As Oryx assaulted Mara's fleet, he had been able to gain access to the Dreaming City. Here, he found Riven, the last of the species of dragons known as Ahamkara. The two of them addressed each other, and Oryx asked Riven if she wanted him to take her. To this, Riven skillfully replied, "Only if you wish it." As Oryx took her, he had unknowingly been tricked, and Riven had bound him to a contract of wish magic, meaning that she had still been taken, but that the binding for her was different. When Oryx perished, unlike the Taken, who were beholden to a higher power, she was able to regain a semblance of her free will. With this, Riven was free to do as she pleased, and it is believed that in this time she made another wish with another hive god, the hive god Savathun. This would result in Riven sending ripples throughout the system, down a path of delicately manipulated threads that would start with a brother driven mad with grief and would end in the possible doom of the Awoken people. Aldrin would be led to discover a heretical fallen Archon, and he would save his life. The name of the Archon was Fikrul, and he was resurrected with ether that had been scorched into dark ether, heavy with Taken energy. He had become the first of the Scorn, an entirely new race made up of the freakishly mutated fallen that had been brought back from the dead as mindless slaves. Together, the Fanatic and Aldrin destroyed the last of the old fallen houses that still remained, the House of Kings. Fikrul then went out into the system and raised 7 other fallen to prominence, elevating them to the rank of barons within the new Scorn hierarchy. Aldrin then allowed himself to be taken in, and the barons were for the most part captured by Cave 6 and the forces of the Reef, including its acting regent, Petrovenge. The barons and Aldrin were sent to languish within the prison of elders, but they would not stay here for long. After being convinced that the fallen people would not survive without his leadership, Varix the Wall released the barons of the Scorn and Aldrin, as well as the entire population of the prison of elders, starting a massive prison riot and creating the possibility for a major outbreak in the system of its most dangerous criminals. Petrovenge called upon Kate Six to put an end to the riot with her, and he decided to bring along his most trusted guardian, us. The program was chaotic, but we were successful in our task of locking it down. However, the Storm Barons had escaped their containment cells, and they were now headed to the lower levels to exfiltrate. Cade decided to destroy the localized network hub of the Prison of Elders so that he could crash it down into the lowest levels, not only potentially cutting off the Barons, but also affording him a faster method of intercepting them. We quickly went in pursuit of Cade and encountered the forces of the Storm for the first time. But when we saw a small wave of light radiate out from Cade's position, we realized that his ghost, Sunbolt, had been killed. Sunbolt was shot by one of the Barons, known as the Rifleman, Pirha, and with that, he was then pummeled into submission by another Baron known as Rexus Bond, the Hangman. Aldrin took Cade's weapon in its strings and leveled it at the Hunter Vanguard. What would Cade's defiant last words be? "How's your sister?" And then, Cade was shot in the chest and began to fade away. We arrived just in time to hear our old friend's last words, and to see Aldrin escape. Petra would arrive moments later, just as Cade had died in our arms. Cade's death wasn't just a loss of a hero or a friend. For many Guardians, losing Cade was akin to losing a piece of one's very identity. When we returned Cade's body, Ikora preached vengeance, and sought to pursue Aldrin throughout the tangled shore with every single Guardian at their disposal. But Zavala stated that the Vanguard could not be stretched more thinly than they already were, and that to abandon the duty of the city would be foolish. Ikora called his opinion cowardice, but knew there was little more that she could do. The Vanguard needed to remain united. However, for us, the situation was far simpler than that. Cade was our friend, and he had been murdered in cold blood by Prince Aldrin and his Storm Barons. And what's more, the murder had happened right in front of us by one we had always desired to hate. Aldrin might try to kill us too if he was given the chance, but he would get no such chance. Aldrin's solve was ours, and for the first time in 5 long years we voiced this sentiment, saying the first 8 words we had spoken in a long time as a simple declaration that we would find Aldrin and take our revenge. With this stunning moment, we walked out and headed straight to the tangled shore. This was the most lawless frontier in the system, where the asteroid belt and the reef collided with a space that technically had no laws at all. This place was teeming with pirates and outlaws that had been holding us in hiding places, such as Critters Well or Thieves Landing. But we also knew that amongst these places lay the Storm and their barons, as well as their leader, Prince Aldrin, who we intended to bring to justice. As we trekked out across the high plains, we were contacted by Petrovenge, who then brought us before the shore's only law, the Spider, the most notorious fallen gangster on the shore. He had recently been forced out of his own stronghold by the Storm, and we decided that clearing out the Storm Barons from the stronghold served all of our purposes, and so we made a deal with Spider. The Barons escaped as we cleared the stronghold, and this meant that we had to start tracking them down one by one. The Spider would inform us as to each of them and their whereabouts, but it would be us that would have to hunt them down. But hunt them down we did. Every single one of the Barons was slaughtered to the last, and so it was that we claimed the lives of Yannick the Rider, Pirha the Rifleman, Rexus Van the Hangman, Alycrus the Machinist, Canix the Mad Bomber, Erasmus the Trickster, and Hyrax the Mindbender. We finally managed to track down Aldrin and the Fanatic, who were making a break for an Awoken watchtower on the edges of the tangled shore. This watchtower links the tangled shore to the dreaming city, and Aldrin intended to infiltrate it and open its gateway using the dark energy that had been building within him and assured the traveler that he had stolen at Riven's urging. Riven had been in Aldrin's head this whole time, creating hallucinations of Mara, pressing Aldrin to release her from the supposed cage of the dreaming city. As we arrived at the watchtower, we killed the fanatic, Fikrul, and with him defeated, the last of the Storm Barons was gone. But Fikrul was not gone for good. He would always be able to return, and continues to plague the Tangled Shore to this day. We made our way further into the watchtower's depths, until we found Aldrin, who had been rewarded for opening the gateway by being consumed by the voice of Riven, an ascendant taken chimera, who was sent forth by Riven as the first arbiter through the gateway. Upon defeating this monstrous creature, we were able to see Aldrin cocked back up by the monster, and it is here that we claimed the Ace of Spades, and sought justice done unto the Prince of the Awoken. But a secret was kept that day. The secret of whether it was us or Petrovenge that would be the executioner of Aldrin. Aldrin's final words would stick with us, and remind us that the line between light and dark was a very thin one, precariously trodden by Guardians and Awoken alike. But Aldrin would die, and with Aldrin's death, Petra would ask us to meet her in the dreaming city, to perform another task. We discovered there that both the Scorn and the Taken had begun to war over the remains of this once sacred place. On our way to meet Petra, we saw Taken Tekens, namely Kali, Sadia, and Shuro-Chi. They had been on the ship with Mara when it had been utterly decimated by Oryx's main weapon during the Taken War's outbreak, and they had been converted into Taken themselves. After facing them briefly, we were transported into the Ascendant Realm, and were then greeted by a disembodied soul, a strange quivering white light that we had seen previously as we assaulted the Taken King's throne world. But this time the light communicated with us, and it turned out that it was Toland, who greeted us and called us foolish, but warned us that this place was only made for the plots and schemes of gods and queens. He led us back to the Ascendant's Plain, where we would find Petra Bench. When we discovered Petra, we met her at a grand machine known as the Oracle Engine, which was capable of reaching out across space to transport and communicate individuals and their worlds. Through this, the supposedly dead monarch of the Awoken, Mara Sol, reached out and spoke to us and Petra, revealing that it was indeed Riven that had corrupted and manipulated Aldrin. This was not some manifestation of Riven's will, however. The Oracle Engine was a purely Awoken creation, and it was indeed Mara this time. For the sin of Riven's usurpation of her brother's will, there would be nothing short of an extreme response. Petra was instructed by Mara to gather a team of Guardians and to assault Riven in the heart of the dreaming city. We would once again assemble a raid team and march upon the great fortress of the enemy. Riven, who was now trapped in the Queen's Walk, was holed up like a commander inside their tower. We would breach their defenses and strike them down. In the path to Riven stood many obstacles, including two of the Tekens, Kali and Shuro-Chi. We freed both of them from their taken bondage, and they talked to us on the nature of Riven's power. We also heard the voice of Riven, speaking to us through the many voices of our friends. It was clear that this was an attempted manipulation, but still, we pressed on, taking down a Spire Keeper, and finally, unlocking the mechanism of the vault that opened onto the Queen's Walk. After we had faced all of these challenges, it was hard not to think of the words of Riven. The fact that she had indeed seen our great wish, and seen that we wished to kill her. Riven was pleased by the power of this wish. 6 immortal god-killers were coming through all of her defenses and using their light to crush enemies in their way, all so that they could reach Riven, all so that they could kill her. It is delightful to wish and bargain with an Ahamkara, but only as long as you do not see what they intend for you, and many that bargain with the Ahamkara will lose. As we went down to the Queen's Walk to face Riven, we saw the last of the Ahamkara for ourselves. Titanic in her size, and with her new token powers at her disposal, Riven truly was one of the most terrifying threats that we had ever faced. But our desire for vengeance outweighed any taken power she possessed, and our lights burned with anger. It was this monster that had corrupted Ultron, and indirectly it was this monster that had slain our friends. We struck out, not just with light, but with rage. We slew the last dragon, and finally the legacy of the great hunt was complete. Riven was slain. But of course, as all Ahamkara are able to do, she was able to commune with us, and even beyond her death, there was more to be done. We rushed her heart to the Tekkens so that they might contain it, Shorochi and Cowley now being lucidly returned to the light. And when we had contained her heart, Riven told us that ours was not in fact the last wish, and that one wish granted deserved another. I cannot wait for you to see what she wished for. Those were the words that Riven spoke to us, and this wish would be made oh so very clear when we returned to the Dreaming City. Riven had unleashed a curse upon it. The blight that had once only been found within the inner sanctum closest to Riven's control was now all over the Dreaming City, and Riven had reached out one last time, irrevocably changing this space. 6 powerful godslayers had unleashed their wills, and wished for the death of the last Ahamkara, and this was fuel enough for a curse so dreadful that the Dreaming City still experiences it to this day. It runs in a 3-week cycle, with 1 week being relatively calm, 1 having middling corruption, and 1 where the corruption is almost complete. The cycle, as far as we can tell, infinitely repeats, and there are hints that the blade transform mind Korea that was taken by Oryx long ago may be involved, although speculation on this particular matter is highly unclear. What we do know is that the source of the corruption came from a great structure below the blind well, from a hallway known as the confluence. The blind well itself was a mechanism constructed by the Awoken long ago that could be used to siphon our light into a powerful charge that would build over 3 weeks. This would charge the gateway found at the confluence and allow us ingress into the Ascendant realm. It was there that we entered a throne world, one of an incredible design, an Awoken throne world. This was how Mara had survived the attack from the beginning of the Taken War. She had not truly died. She had been trapped within Oryx's netherworld, but when she had died, she was able to make it back to the shores of this place. This place known as Elisea. The structure, however, was broken and damaged. Oryx's agents had defiled this place, and now it was occupied by another hive, one of the supposed daughters of Savatun herself, a witch known as Dul Inkaru. She was apparently the source of the corruption, and she was able to be destroyed, but only at the apex of the corruption in the 3-week cycle, and no matter how many times she had been killed, the cycle would still repeat, and she would always come back. In addition, we were able to enter the Oracle engine every 3 weeks, and would be transported to Mara, who had set up her court in view of the Milky Way. We were able to hear her input on the situations that were manifesting over the next few months, and it was at this moment that we saw her examine the darkness, commune with the mind, chastise us for killing Aldrin, verbally abuse our ghost, who had believed that she had been slain in inaction, and finally, she would bid us farewell, in order to go off and play another part in the cosmic war that was fast approaching. It was also in the Queen's Court that we were able to lean into an observation table, at which point we saw a vision. We saw Prince Aldrin being resurrected within the Dreaming City by a ghost. Prince Aldrin, who had become a guardian, though this was the last that we would see or hear of him, and he had not been sighted since. Back in the tower, however, a new face emerged. His name was unknown, and he preferred to go by a moniker that everyone could remember. They called him the Drifter, and he offered Guardians a new competitive arena called Gambit, which not only allowed them to fight the enemies of humanity, but also forced them to exploit the darker powers so that they might be able to learn how to best bend those powers of darkness to their will. These games would continue for the foreseeable future, in spite of the fact that the Vanguard and other elements such as the Practic Order would not officially endorse them. All of this behind the scenes was set up by a most infamous figure, Alpha, the man with the golden gun. Though his reasons are too complex to get into at this moment, wished for us to learn more powers than merely the light. He wished for us to evolve and to become stronger weapons against the darkness. After the main events of the Forsaken campaign, we would next see a new tale emerge. A mysterious annex in the tower opened up, and in this annex a new vendor known as Ada-1 could be found. She represented the final remnants of the prestigious Black Armory, a weapons foundry that had been created in the Golden Age and could create some of the finest weapons possible. Ada-1, however, did not trust the Guardians at first, given that during the Dark Age, when she had been resurrected as an exile, there were many ensuing warlords, or rogue risen, that had made an effort to kill her and other members of the Black Armory team. Ada-1, to this day, is the only survivor. After recapturing forges for her, and eventually decrypting the secrets of the Black Armory, Ada would begin to trust us. And with that, we helped her hunt down and reactivate a series of devices across the system with which we could forge new implements of war. In this process, we discovered a fallen crime syndicate known as the Terror Scourge, led by a fallen known as Civics, lost to none. The gang was intent on supplying weapons with Black Armory technology in them for any who would be willing to buy. Civics' only priority seemingly being to create anarchy across the system. At a certain point, Civics and the Terror Scourge grew bold enough to even make a daring attack on the city. Not a full-fledged attack like Twilight Gap or Six Fronts, but merely a break-in, where they weakened the defenses around the Black Armory vault in the old ruined Bodza district, a vault known as Volgedasu. Inside lay not only precious Black Armory wares, but also the Black Armory's history. It was crucial that we recovered this. Using Black Armory and fallen technology, however, the Terror Scourge had constructed a giant fallen mechanism known as Insurrection Prime, which we destroyed and defeated, saving the Black Armory's vault from being completely plundered. Finally, in the process of reforging a powerful weapon once used by Ada, we would kill Civics and end the threat of the Terror Scourge for good. This would allow us to return the weapon to Ada, and we would discover that she had used it to defend the Black Armory founder and her former mother, Henrietta Milan. It turned out that the Black Armory papers, another relic salvaged from both Eversea and the various fallen that we killed them off, had indeed also contained notes about Ada-1 and her creation. Henrietta documented all of her thoughts in them, and when we recovered all the pages, Ada thanked us. Maybe now at last trusting us. Then we recovered one final piece of technology, an obsidian accelerator, unlocking the final purpose of Ada-1. She was a mobile forge, able to imbue the phase technology of the Black Armory at will. She had been a combination of both the exo-technology of Clovis Grey and the miraculous forges that the Black Armory had endeavored to create. She was the brainchild, not of Henrietta Milan, but of her peer, Helga, who had always believed that despite Clovis Grey's somewhat more dubious nature, they were valuable, and that their technology could be made to serve the Armory. It turned out that she was indeed correct. Later in the year, we were invited by the Drifter to join in his games once again, and to take part in a new scheme that he called Gambit Prime. In the process of this, we also discovered that the Drifter had been working with a mysterious organization called the Nine. The organization reached out to the Drifter through their agents, namely the Emissary, who was once a guardian of the city and a retainer to the Awoken Queen known as Orin. now titled Orin the Lost after she went out to pursue the mine after the death of her lover. In a series of invitations to understand, we were shown the truth of the relationship between the Drifter and Orin, as well as a few key moments and some truths and ponderings of the mine regarding various other characters within Destiny's universe. The ninth and final of these invitations gave us a vision of the Drifter being told to keep Gambit running, as well as the attached activity of Reckoning. The mine had helped him set this up, and the mine had warned him that soon darkness would be coming, and that they would need to make ready for it. The Drifter also, at this point, asked us whether we were loyal to him or the Vanguard, and offered us a choice. Many Guardians were given these choices, and whether you were loyal to the Vanguard or not was entirely a point to be answered by yourself. But regardless, we would be able to partake in Gambit and its games no matter what we did. Finally, at the start of the summer, we were contracted again by the joyful Emperor Callus, who invited us once more to grow fat from strength. Having seen us perform incredible feats across the system, it was Callus's belief that he could recruit us to become a shadow. Shadows, in the context of Callus's cabal, were powerful agents, assassins, generals, and leaders of Callus's forces. They always represented the apex of their species in every possible facet of their specialization. Shadows were given a certain amount of autonomy, but they were bound to Callus's will, and Callus had made it clear to us by this point that his goal was not to serve the light. Callus would relay to us a series of dubious histories known as the Chronicon that were likely doctored to approve a more loyalist-friendly version of history. Regardless, the encounter in question that is of most incredible note is that at one point during his exile, Callus supposedly encountered the darkness, and saw it to be the coming end of the universe. He then believed it to be his divine right and his divine purpose to usher in the age of darkness and prepare us all for the end of the world by allowing conflict to subside and to allow as many as possible to live in harmony for the remainder of the universe's time. This was the purpose for which Callus wished to recruit us, and Callus would lead us into the menagerie where he placed many challenges for us to prove our worth once again. And of course, as his moniker of grow fat from strength would suggest, with these challenges came great rewards. After this, Callus asked us for one more favor in dispatching a hive champion that had betrayed him. In his time of exile, Callus had retaken an Athenaean world, an archival world of the Cabal. Within it, he found a hive crown, which showed the potential to control the hive's swarms. Not wishing to wear the crown personally, lest it should corrupt him, Callus instead used the incredible gene manipulation technology of the Cabal to form a mighty warrior named Galran, titanic in his size. Galran had been edited to hold a greater strength of mind than the typical Cabal soldier. This was still pointless though, as Galran was corrupted within minutes of the crown of sorrow being placed upon his head. Callus therefore asked us to revoke this power, and to bring him to heel, killing him, which we did in no short order. With Galran's fall came another period of uneasy calm, but as the year, filled with hard moments and grueling tests, came to a close for us, an entirely different chapter was about to begin. It was suddenly becoming clear that at this time, new light was starting to fast approach. Soldiers of humanity had always been rising, but for some unknown reason, there was a mass of new guardians, new lights that were joining our ranks, strengthening the many friendships created and many new fire teams forming along the way. The Guardian Orders as a whole began to grow stronger as their numbers swelled, with Guardians returning from all frontiers and new lights joining our ranks. But this was all for the better, because on the horizon, the darkness was closer than we thought. Once again it was brewing, and just as it had done before, it began to creep towards us. as it had done before at the Battle of Moray-Ibrian during the events of Proto's Rise. The moon would play host to nightmares, and these nightmares would find Eris Morn. Thank you so much for listening and for watching the video. If you made it to the end all in one sitting, you're an absolute monster. You really give yourself a pat on the back. That's probably the biggest YouTube video I've ever made, and it's probably one of the biggest YouTube videos you've ever watched. Remember, however, that there are several things you can do if you really want to show your appreciation. First of which is you should go down into the comments section and you should thank Captain Tullis and Marcus. Tullis for helping with the editing of this, and Marcus for creating those amazing pieces of art that you saw at the beginning of every section that were animated by Tullis, but regardless, you can buy them from Marcus's own website, which again is going to be linked down in the description. I want to thank you for watching though, because your viewership is the most important thing to me on this channel. And whilst you can do all sorts of other things to support, for free, what you can do right now is simply hit like on the video so we can share this with everyone else. And of course, if you want more Destiny commentary and more Destiny lore-related content, you can hit the subscribe button and the bell next to subscribe to stay up to date with email notifications. Of course, there is something else that you could possibly do if you are incredibly generous. You can either donate to my Patreon or you can join the channel memberships that I have available on YouTube. This, of course, is if I've got memberships enabled at this point in time. I'll need to see about that, but if you are so inclined and if you want to show your appreciation, that would be amazing. But do know, as always, that no matter what, your viewership is quite enough for me. I hope that you have enjoyed this monumental project that we poured our hearts and souls into, and I hope that you look forward to joining me in the world of Destiny. And to those of you that are new knights, to those of you that have only just started your journey as Guardians, I would simply say this to you: Prododelphia ad Astra. I'll see you, Starside.